Houses of Horror. The Ghost of a Hand by Sheridan Fanu. Miss Rebecca Chatsworth, in a letter dated late in the autumn of 1753, gives a minute and curious relation of occurrences in the tiled house, which, it is plain, although at starting she protests against all such fooleries, she has heard with a peculiar sort of particularity. I was for printing the entire letter, which is really very singular as well as characteristic, but my publisher meets me with his veto, and I believe he is right. The worthy old lady's letter is perhaps too long, and I must rest content with a few hungry notes of its tenor. That year, and somewhere about the 24th of October, there broke out a strange dispute between Mr. Alderman Harper of High Street, Dublin, and my Lord Castle Mallard, who, in virtue of his cousinship to the young heir's mother, had undertaken for him the management of the tiny estate on which the tiled house stood. This Alderman Harper had agreed for a lease of the house for his daughter, who was married to a gentleman named Prosser. He furnished it and put up hangings and otherwise went to considerable expense. Mr. and Mrs. Prosser came there sometime in June, and after having parted with a good many servants in the interval, she made up her mind that she could not live in the house, and her father waited on Lord Castle Mallard, and told him plainly that he would not take out the lease, because the house was subjected to annoyances which he could not explain. In plain terms, he said it was haunted, and that no servants would live there more than a few weeks, and that after what his son-in-law's family had suffered there, not only should he be excused from taking a lease of it, but that the house itself ought to be pulled down as a nuisance, and the habitual haunt of something worse than human malefactors. Lord Castle Mallard filed a bill in the equity side of the Exchequer to compel Mr. Alderman Harper to perform his contract by taking out the lease. But Alderman drew an answer, supported by no less than 7 long affidavits, copies of all of which were furnished to his lordship, and with the desired effect. For rather than compel him to place them upon the file of the court, his lordship struck and consented to release him. I am sorry the case did not proceed at least far enough to place upon the files of the court the very authentic and unaccountable story which Miss Rebecca relates. The annoyances described did not begin till the end of August, when one evening Mrs. Prosser, quite alone, was sitting in the twilight at the back parlour window, which was open, looking out into the orchard, and plainly saw a hand stealthily placed upon the stone window-sill outside, as if by someone beneath the window at her right side, intending to climb up. There was nothing but the hand, which was rather short, but handsomely formed, and white and plump, laid on the edge of the window-sill, and it was not a very young hand, but one aged somewhere about 40, as she conjectured. It was only a few weeks before that the horrible robbery at Clondalkin had taken place, and the lady fancied that the hand was that of one of the miscreants who was now about to scale the windows of the tiled house. She uttered a loud scream and an ejaculation of terror, and at the same moment the hand was quietly withdrawn. Search was made in the orchard, but there were no indications of any persons having been under the window, beneath which, ranged along the wall, stood a great column of flower-pots, which it seemed must have prevented anyone's coming within reach of it. The same night there came a hasty tapping, every now and then, at the window of the kitchen. The women grew frightened, and the servant man, taking firearms with him, opened the back door, but discovered nothing. As he shut it, however, he said a thump came on it, and a pressure as of somebody striving to force his way in, which frightened him. And though the tapping went on upon the kitchen window panes, he made no further explorations. About 6 o'clock on the Saturday evening following, the cook, An honest, sober woman, now aged nigh 60 years, being alone in the kitchen, saw, on looking up, it is supposed the same fat but aristocratic-looking hand, laid with its palm against the glass, as if feeling carefully for some inequality in its surface. She cried out, and said something like a prayer on seeing it, but it was not withdrawn for several seconds after. After this, for a great many nights, there came at first a low and afterwards an angry rapping, as it seemed with a set of clenched knuckles at the back door, and the servant man would not open it, but called to know who was there, and there came no answer, only a sound as if the palm of the hand was placed against it, and drawn slowly from side to side with a sort of soft, groping motion. All this time, sitting in the back parlour, which for the time they used as a drawing-room, Mr. and Mrs. Prosser were disturbed by rappings at the window, sometimes very low and furtive, like a clandestine signal, and at others sudden, and so loud as to threaten the breaking of the pane. This was all at the back of the house, which looked upon the orchard, as you know. But on a Tuesday night, at about 9:30, there came precisely the same rappings at the hall door, and went on, to the great annoyance of the master and terror of his wife, at intervals for nearly 2 hours. After this, for several days and nights, they had no annoyance whatsoever, and began to think that the nuisance had expended itself. But on the night of the 13th of September, Jane Easterbrook, an English maid, having gone into the pantry for the small silver bowl in which her mistress's posset was served, happening to look up at the little window of only 4 panes, observed, through an auger hole which was drilled through the window frame for the admission of a bolt to secure the shutter, a white, pudgy finger, first the tip, and then the 2 first joints introduced, and turned about this way and that, crooked against the inside, as if in search of a fastening, which its owner designed to push aside. When the maid got back into the kitchen, we are told, she fell into a swoon, and was all the next day very weak. Mr. Prosser, being, I've heard, a hard-headed and conceited sort of fellow, scouted the ghost, and sneered at the fears of his family. He was privately of opinion that the whole affair was a practical joke or a fraud, and waited an opportunity of catching the rogue flagrante delicto. He did not long keep this theory to himself, but let it out by degrees with no stint of oaths and threats, believing that some domestic traitor held the thread of the conspiracy. Indeed, it was time something were done, for not only his servants, but good Mrs. Prosser herself had grown to look unhappy and anxious. They kept at home from the hour of sunset, and would not venture about the house after nightfall, except in couples. The knocking had ceased for about a week, when one night, Mrs. Prosser being in the nursery, her husband, who was in the parlour, heard it begin very softly at the hall door. The air was quite still, which favoured his hearing distinctly. This was the first time there had been any disturbance at that side of the house, and the character of the summons was changed. Mr. Prosser, leaving the parlour door open, it seems, went quietly into the hall. The sound was that of beating on the outside of the stout door, softly and regularly, with the flat of the hand. He was going to open it suddenly, but changed his mind, and went back very quietly, and on to the head of the kitchen stair, where was a strong closet over the pantry, in which he kept his firearms, swords, and canes. Here he called his manservant, whom he believed to be honest, and with a pair of loaded pistols in his own coat pockets, and giving another pair to him, he went as lightly as he could, followed by the men, and with a stout walking cane in his hand, forward to the door. Everything went as Mr. Prosser wished. The besieger of his house, so far from taking fright at their approach, grew more impatient, and the sort of patting which had aroused his attention at first assumed the rhythm and emphasis of a series of double knocks. Mr. Prosser, angry, opened the door with his right arm across, cane in hand. Looking, he saw nothing, but his arm was jerked up oddly, as it might be with the hollow of a hand, and something passed under it, with a kind of gentle squeeze. The servant neither saw nor felt anything, and did not know why his master looked back so hastily, cutting with his cane, and shutting the door with so sudden a slam. From that time Mr. Prosser discontinued his angry talk and swearing about it, and seemed nearly as averse from the subject as the rest of his family. He grew, in fact, very uncomfortable, feeling an inward persuasion that, when, in answer to the summons, he had opened the hall door, he had actually given admission to the besieger. He said nothing to Mrs. Prosser, but went up earlier to his bedroom, where he read a while in his Bible and said his prayers. I hope the particular relation of this circumstance does not indicate its singularity. He lay awake for a good while, it appears, and, as he supposed, about 12:15, he heard the soft palm of a hand patting on the outside of the bedroom door, and then brushed slowly along it. Up bounced Mr. Prosser, very much frightened, and locked the door, crying, "Who's there?" but receiving no answer, but the same brushing sound of a soft hand drawn over the panels which he knew only too well. In the morning, the housemaid was terrified by the impression of a hand in the dust of the little parlour table, where they had been unpacking delft and other things the day before. The print of the naked foot in the sea sand did not frighten Robinson Crusoe half so much. They were by this time all nervous, and some of them half crazed about the hand. Mr. Prosser went to examine the mark, and made light of it, but, as he swore afterwards, rather to quiet his servants than from any comfortable feeling about it in his own mind. However, he had them all, one by one, into the room, and made each place his or her hand, palm downward, on the same table, thus taking a similar impression from every person in the house, including himself and his wife, and his affidavit deposed that the formation of the hand so impressed differed altogether from those of the living inhabitants of the house, and corresponded with that of the hand seen by Mrs. Prosser and by the cook. Whoever or whatever the owner of that hand might be, they all felt this subtle demonstration to mean that it was declared he was no longer out of doors, but had established himself in the house. And now Mrs. Prosser began to be troubled with strange and horrible dreams, some of which are set out in detail in Aunt Rebecca's long letter, are really very appalling nightmares. But one night, as Mr. Prosser closed his bedchamber door, he was struck somewhat by the utter silence of the room, there being no sound of breathing, which seemed unaccountable to him, as he knew his wife was in bed, and his ears were particularly sharp. There was a candle burning on a small table at the foot of the bed, besides the one he held in one hand, a heavy ledger connected with his father-in-law's business being under his arm. He drew the curtain at the side of the bed, and saw Mrs. Prosser lying, as for a few seconds he mortally feared, dead, her face being motionless, white, and covered with a cold dew, and on the pillow, close beside her head, and just within the curtains, was, as he first thought, a toad, but really the same fattish hand, the wrist resting on the pillow, and the fingers extended towards her temple. Mr. Prosser, with a horrified jerk, pitched the ledger right at the curtains, behind which the owner of the hand might be supposed to stand. The hand was instantaneously and smoothly snatched away. The curtains made a great wave, and Mr. Prosser got round the bed in time to see the closet door, which was at the other side, pulled to by the same white, puffy hand, as he believed. He drew the door open with a fling, and stared in. But the closet was empty, except for the clothes hanging from the pegs on the wall and the dressing table and looking-glass facing the windows. He shut it sharply and locked it, and felt for a minute, he says, as if he were like to lose his wits. Then, ringing at the bell, he brought the servants, and with much ado they recovered Mrs. Prosser from a sort of trance, in which he says, from her looks, she seemed to have suffered the pains of death, and Aunt Rebecca adds, from what she told me of her visions with her own lips, he might have added, and of hell also. But the occurrence which seems to have determined the crisis was the strange sickness of their eldest child, a little boy aged between 2 and 3 years. He lay awake, seemingly in paroxysms of terror, and the doctors, who were called in, set down the symptoms to incipient water on the brain. Mrs. Prosser used to sit up with the nurse by the nursery fire, much troubled in mind about the condition of her child. His bed was placed sideways along the wall, with its head against the door of a press or cupboard, which, however, did not shut quite close. There was a little valance about a foot deep round the top of the child's bed, and this descended within some 10 or 12 inches of the pillow on which it lay. They observed that the little creature was quieter whenever they took it up and held it on their laps. They had just replaced him, as he seemed to have grown quite sleepy and tranquil, but he was not 5 minutes in his bed when he began to scream in one of his frenzies of terror. At the same moment, the nurse for the first time detected, and Mrs. Prosser equally plainly saw, following the direction of her eyes, the real cause of the child's sufferings. Protruding through the aperture of the press, and shrouded in the shade of the valance, they plainly saw the white, fat hand, palm downwards, presented towards the head of the child. The mother uttered a scream and snatched the child from its little bed, and she and the nurse ran down to the ladies' sleeping room, where Mr. Prosser was in bed, shutting the door as they entered, and they had hardly done so when a gentle tap came to it from the outside. There is a great deal more, but this will suffice. The singularity of the narrative seems to me to be this, that it describes the ghost of a hand, and no more. The person to whom that hand belonged never once appeared, nor was it a hand separated from a body, but only a hand so manifested and introduced that its owner was always, by some crafty accident, hidden from view. In the year 1819, at a college breakfast, I met a Mr. Prosser, a thin, grave, but rather chatty old gentleman, with very white hair drawn back into a pigtail, and he told us all, with a concise particularity, a story of his cousin James Prosser, who, when an infant, had slept for some time in what his mother said was a haunted nursery in an old house near Chapelizod, and who, whenever he was ill, over-fatigued, or in any wise feverish, suffered all through his life, as he had done from a time he could scarcely remember, from a vision of a certain gentleman, fat and pale, every curl of whose wig, every button and fold of whose laced clothes, and every feature and line of whose sensual, benignant, and unwholesome face was as minutely engraven upon his memory as the dress and lineaments of his own grandfather's portrait, which hung before him every day at breakfast, dinner, and supper. Mr. Prosser mentioned this as an instance of a curiously monotonous, individualized, and persistent nightmare, and hinted the extreme horror and anxiety with which his cousin, of whom he spoke in the past tense as poor Jemmy, was at any time induced to mention it. I've Got to Believe It by Bruce Walker. Even when I was a kid in Emerson Junior High, Mrs. Trudell was Westport's greatest mystery. No one had seen her in 20 years. It was said that she never left the attic apartment of the huge red brick house which stood, walled in by holly trees, next to the school grounds. I don't know how true that was, but I know that I had never talked to any kids or older people in the neighborhood who had even caught a glimpse of her. The only link of reality between the curious mansion and the rest of Westport was Mr. Trudell. Mr. Trudell was a tall, sturdy fellow with bushy black brows, like those of John L. Lewis. Promptly at 4:15 each afternoon, he emerged from the great oak doors, wearing a black derby and a Chesterfield evening coat, and carrying a gold-headed cane. Thus dressed and equipped, he walked at a military gait for 8 blocks to Hendry's grocery, bought a sack of meat and vegetables, and returned to the house by 5 o'clock. At night, if you passed by, you could see a kerosene lamp glimmering through the holly trees from his study window and a dim glow at an attic window. Those 2 lights and Mr. Trudell's daily expedition to Hendry's were the only signs of life about the gloomy place, year in and year out, as long as anyone could remember. It was in connection with these daily trips to Hendry's that I got mixed up in this horrible affair that haunts me night and day. Due to my finances, I had to quit Whitman University after my sophomore year and go to work. I was lucky or unlucky enough to get a job at Hendry's. Almost immediately, old man Trudell took a fancy to me and asked me to fill his order each afternoon. As a kid, I had been scared stiff of his grim frowns, just as all the other Westport kids were. But brought in contact with him at the store, I soon discovered that he was just a lonely old man, gruff in some ways, but a soft-hearted, self-conscious fellow under his stern exterior. Each afternoon, when I placed the groceries in his arms, he would nod and say brusquely, "You must come out some evening, lad, and we'll have a round of checkers." "Thank you, I will, sir." I was ready enough to promise this, but deep inside I felt I'd never be brave enough to venture into the Trudell house, which was still nothing less than a gloomy, haunted house to me. One afternoon, however, shortly after I had waited on him, Mr. Trudell was struck by a car within a block of his home. The first I knew of the accident was when I got a call from General Hospital saying that the old man had been injured and wanted to see me. It was most urgent, they said, and I went. "It's kind of you to come, son," he said when we were alone in his hospital room. His left arm was in a sling, his face was badly lacerated, and heavy bandages were on his head. You see, I knew no one else to turn to at a time like this. Most of my friends have passed on. I sat down beside his bed. "I'll do anything I can, sir," I consoled him. Tears came to his eyes, and he choked up so he couldn't talk for a time. Then he cleared his throat. "It's my wife, lad. She has no one but me to take care of her. Perhaps I can find a nurse to stay with her for a few days," I suggested. No. She doesn't need a nurse, lad. Not that. It's just that she's timid about meeting new people. Her contacts have been so few since our little boy was killed, some 30 years ago." "Little boy? You had a son, sir?" "Yes," Trudell said sorrowfully. "A handsome little fellow. On his 6th birthday, his mother gave him a pair of roller skates. At an intersection near the house, a car, one of the earliest automobiles, struck him. He was carried home, still clasping his precious skates. My wife stopped living when she stood with the dying boy in her arms. Since then, she's only been existing." I stared in pity at the old man's quivering lips. I bent forward to straighten the covers on his chest. "I'll do whatever I can for you, sir," I promised. He told me what to do, and at twilight, carrying a sack of groceries, I strode up the walk among the holly trees to the grim old house that I had dreaded for as long as I could remember. My hand trembled as I unlocked the massive front door and shut myself in the dark, musty hall that was a tomb of silence. I groped about in the blackness, my heels sinking into a rug that smothered all sounds. I found the candle Mr. Trudell had told me would be on the hall table. I lighted the candle and held it aloft, gazing curiously about at the huge, high-ceilinged rooms, elegantly furnished with bric-a-brac and old-fashioned furniture. Beyond the swinging door at the end of the hall, I found the narrow kitchen, which smelled heavily of orange peel and grease. Following Mr. Trudell's directions, I prepared a simple tray with 2 pork chops, toast, orange juice, butter, jelly. I stuck the candle on a saucer and started the ascent up 2 flights of richly carpeted stairs to the attic. My hands trembled so that I joggled the dishes about and spilled hot tallow on my wrist. In a moment, I would be face to face with the woman no one else in Westport, except Mr. Trudell, had seen in 30 years. I found the attic doorway blocked by a closed door. I set the tray on the top step and knocked timidly. An eerie, stealthy silence followed. I know it wasn't the heat of the flickering candle that caused sweat to break out on my face and forehead. However, there was no response to my knock. I tried a second time, fighting an impulse to turn and flee down the stairway. "Mrs. Trudell! Mrs. Trudell!" I called out, but realized I was only whispering the words. I tried the knob. It turned easily, and the door swung inward, as though inviting me into the shadowy darkness beyond. I picked up the tray with such unsteady hands that I upset the orange juice. I stepped into the room, looking about fearfully in the guttering candlelight. Except for a huge flat-top desk and a chair in the center of a dark rug, the room was unfurnished. On the desk, a great yellow scrapbook lay open, and beside this ponderous collection of newspaper clippings stood a white paste pot and a kerosene lamp with a white, hand-painted chimney. Directly in front of the scrapbook stood a large picture of a little boy. I went up closer to the desk, holding the candle near the picture. He was the most handsome youngster I had ever seen. He was smiling up at me with large, friendly eyes, prideful of his dapper new brown suit. On the lower left-hand corner of the picture was the single word, Jackie. Waves of silence washed against my ears, pressing at my eardrums. "Mrs. Trudell," I cried out, "don't be afraid. I'm just a friend your husband sent. I have your supper here." I heard no answering movement in that room or from the bedroom beyond an open door to the right. She's afraid, I thought. As afraid as I am, and she won't come out until I've gone. I set the tray on the writing desk and examined the scrapbook more closely. Every newspaper clipping told of accidents to children caused by motor cars. The clippings were from many different papers, ranging from the Westport Morning Star to the Baltimore Sun and the San Francisco Herald-Examiner. The name of each paper and the date was noted, carefully printed in ink beside each clipping. In that moment of revelation, my heart went out to the poor, lonely, heartbroken mother. So this was how she had spent many hours of the long years of seclusion, keeping a record of the daily toll of accidents which grieved mothers throughout America. This was dipping into a privacy too intimate for such as a casual acquaintance as I. I took the candle and hurried down the stairs and out of the house. But I knew no peace on my walk homeward, disturbed about the strange old lady I had been unable to find. What would she think when Mr. Trudell did not return all night? To whom could she turn in her worry? Where had she hidden while I was in the attic apartment? I took a taxi to the hospital instead of going directly home, because I wanted to report to Mr. Trudell and ask what I should do. But he had become unconscious, and remained so up until the time I felt that I had to go home to get some sleep. But I couldn't sleep a wink, and went to work the next morning so weary I could scarcely do my routine duties at the store. I called the hospital frequently during the day, checking on the old man's condition. I became more and more alarmed as he remained in a coma. After the store closed that afternoon, I wandered about the streets, trying to figure out what to do. Someone had to look after Mrs. Trudell. As I had promised the old man I would permit no one else to enter the house until he returned, I had no choice except to go back to the eerie house among the mysterious holly trees. I stopped at my house to get some food from our own icebox, and then sneaked it out while Mom was talking to visitors in the living room. Again, I found the Trudell house pitch dark and quiet from top to bottom. By candlelight, I prepared another tray in the kitchen, and then forced myself up the 2 long flights of stairs to the attic door. The panic which I had known the night before returned, but I set the tray down and knocked and waited, chilled to the marrow of my innermost bones. Again, silence answered my knock. Too frightened to knock again, I pushed into the room, carrying the tray and candle, expecting to find I don't know what. The tray I had brought up the previous night lay there, untouched. Grease had formed on the pork chops, the butter had melted, and the toast had dried out. I set the second tray beside the first, and then lighted the lamp, determined to find Mrs. Trudell and stem the curiosity that was driving me mad. In the bedroom, everything was in order. It was a neat, clean room with a pink spread on the bed, white curtains at the attic windows. But the silence of the place haunted me, and I turned back to the writing room and stopped, stock still, the lamp poised in my hands. Just inside the door from the stairway stood a tall, stately woman with dark hair. She wore a high-necked white dress that touched the floor. In her arms she carried a child, a little boy clasping a pair of skates and moaning with pain. His left leg hung limp, covered with blood, and a crimson streak was spreading across his forehead. His great dark eyes, bleak with pain, stared at me, and for a moment he ceased moaning. I felt so weak I nearly dropped the lamp, but the woman came slowly toward me as I stared back at her and the boy. "Please," she said in the softest voice I ever heard. "Jackie's been hurt by a car. We need a doctor quickly. Won't you call one?" "Yes," I cried hoarsely. "Of course. I'll go right away. Put him on the bed. I'll be back as soon as I call a doctor." I started around them to the doorway. The little boy clutched the skates more tightly in his small white hands, and one of the loose wheels fell to the floor. I stooped, picked it up, and held it out to the child, but the woman cried, "Please hurry." I thrust the wheel into my pocket, set the lamp on the table, and raced down the stairs through the dark. Across the street, a light was burning in the Henderson residence. A maid let me in and showed me to the telephone. I called Dr. Simmons, our family doctor, and he promised to hurry over to Trudell's immediately. In a few minutes, I was back at the attic door. "The doctor is on the way," I announced, stepping into the lamplight. I looked about, a prickly feeling at my neck. The room was quiet again, and bare as the first time I had ever seen it. Holding my breath, I took the lamp and went into the bedroom. The woman and boy were not there. "Mrs. Trudell!" I shouted. The silence mocked me. I backed away to the writing desk and set the lamp down so I wouldn't drop it in my nervous search. A bell exploded in the depths of the house, and my throbbing heart nearly burst. Then I realized it was Dr. Simmons at the door. "Where's the little boy you told me about, Bill?" he asked, as I showed him in, holding the candle for him to see by. I sat down on the bottom step, exhausted. My body shook as though gripped by fever. "I don't know, Doctor," I choked out. "He and Mrs. Trudell were in the attic when I called you. She asked me to call." Dr. Simmons, a stubby, bald-headed man, stared at me curiously. "Let's go up and look around, Bill," he said, taking the candle from me. But I couldn't move. I sat in the darkness, listening to him searching the attic rooms. He came back down to me. "There's no one up there, Bill." He bent down, felt my forehead with his hot hand. "Better let me take you home, son." "No," I cried. "I've got to go out to the hospital. Mr. Trudell asked me to look after things here. I've got to go talk to him." Dr. Simmons shook his head. "I'm afraid you can't do that, Bill. The old man died about an hour ago." I got up and wandered alone out into the night. I walked around the school grounds in the moonlight, trying to get a grip on myself. I had to fight for sanity. Surely I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Or had I? I stared back up at the attic windows, now shining in the moonlight above the dark holly trees. Of course, I had imagined it. I pieced it together. The excitement of going into the house I had feared since childhood, coupled with the old man's story of the little boy, had reacted to produce the illusion of the woman and the child. Of course. I started back to the house when I saw Dr. Simmons coming toward me across the lawn. "I just found Mrs. Trudell, Bill," he called out. "She was lying across a bed on the second floor. My guess is that she saw her husband's accident yesterday from the windows, and the shock killed her. She's been dead for at least 30 hours. I felt relieved in a strange, exhilarating way. Of course, I'd imagined everything in the attic then. Perspiration bathed my forehead. I drew out my handkerchief to wipe it away when a heavy object fell out upon the ground in the moonlight. I picked it up. It was the wheel from the boy's skate. The Curse of the House by Robert Bloch. Did you ever hear of a haunted house? I nodded slowly. Well, this case is different. I'm not afraid of a haunted house. My problem is that there's a house haunting me. I sat silent for a long moment, staring at Will Banks blankly. He in turn regarded me calmly, his long, thin face impassive, and his grey eyes shining quite rationally as they focused at random on various objects about my office. But a slight, almost imperceptible twitching of the lips indicated the undoubtedly hyperneurasthenic tendencies, which his calm exterior hid. Nevertheless, I mused, the man had courage. Victims of hallucination and obsession are usually quite unstrung, and their schizoid tendencies generally are uncontrollably manifested. But Will Banks had guts. This thought came quickly, then was overmastered by curiosity regarding his statement. "There's a house haunting me." He had said it so matter-of-factly, so calmly, too calmly. If he had been hysterical about it, or melodramatic, then it would indicate that he realized his plight as a victim of an obsession and was trying to fight it. But this acceptance implied implicit faith in his delusion. A bad sign. "Perhaps you'd better tell me the story from the beginning," I said, a bit nervous myself. "There is a story, I presume?" Banks's face, all at once, displayed genuine agitation. One hand rose unconsciously to brush back his blonde, straight hair from the perspiring forehead. His mouth twitched more perceptibly. "There is a story, Doctor," he said. "It isn't an easy story for me to tell, and it won't be an easy story for you to believe. But it's true." "Good God!" he burst out. "Don't you understand? That's what makes it so awful. It's true." I adopted a professional suavity as I ignored his emotion and offered him a cigarette. He held it in nervous fingers without lighting it. His eyes sought mine imploringly. "You aren't laughing at me, are you, Doctor? In your capacity?" He could not bring himself to say psychiatrist. "You must listen to a lot of things that sound peculiar. You do, don't you?" I nodded, offering him a light. The first puff braced him. "And, Doctor, another thing. You fellows have some kind of medical oath, don't you? About violating confidences and all that sort of thing? Because there are certain—" "Tell your story, Mr. Banks," I said, briskly. "I promise you that I'll do what I can to help. But in order to help you, I must have absolute sincerity from you." Will Banks spoke. "I told you that I'm haunted by a house. Well, that's true, strange as it may sound. But the circumstances are stranger still. To begin with, I'm going to ask you to believe in witchcraft. Get that, Doctor? I'm going to ask you to believe. I'm not arguing with you to convince you, although I think that can be done. I'm merely asking you. That in itself should convince you of my sincerity and my sanity. Unless I miss my guess, the sure indication of a psychotic personality is when the deluded puts up a long, fantastic argument to convince his hearer. Am I right?" I nodded. It was true. "Well, I'm merely asking you to believe in witchcraft for the duration of my tale, just as I believed years ago when I went to Edinburgh. I had been a student of the lost sciences men used to call the black arts. I was interested in the use ancient sorcerers made of mathematical symbols in their ceremonies, surmising that perhaps they were unconsciously employing geometric patterns which hold keys to the outer cosmos, even the fourth dimension, recognized by modern-day scientists. I spent years in the fascinating pursuit of olden devil worship, traveling to Naples, Prague, Budapest, Cologne. I shall not say what I came to believe, nor shall I do more than hint at the survival of demon worship in the modern world. Enough that, after a time, I established connections with the vast underground system controlling hidden cults. I learned codes, signals, mysteries. I was accepted, and material for my monograph was being piled up. Then I went to Edinburgh. Edinburgh, where once all men believed in witchcraft. Talk about New England witch-baiters. That's childish stuff compared to the Scottish town where not 20 or 30 old hags, but 30,000 witches and sorcerers once lived and lurked. Think of it. 300 years ago there were 30,000 of them, meeting in old houses, creeping through underground tunnels in which lay buried the black secrets of their blood cults. Macbeth and Tam O'Shanter hint of it, but vaguely. Here, in ancient Edinburgh, I hope to find the final corroboration for my theories. Here, in the veritable witch's cauldron of wizardry, I settled and began to investigate. My underground connection served me, and after a time I was admitted to certain houses. In them, I met people who still live a secret life of their own under the very surface of a quiet, modern Scottish city. Some of those dwellings are many hundreds of years old, still in use, some in use from below. No, I won't explain that. Then I met Brian Droom. Black Brian Droom he was called, and in the coven he had another name. He was a gigantic man, bearded and swarthy. When we met, I was reminded of descriptions concerning Gilles de Rais, reminded in more ways than one. Indeed, he did have French blood, though his ancestors had settled in Edinburgh hundreds of years ago. They had built Brian's house, and it was this house that I particularly wanted to see. For Brian Droom's ancestors had been sorcerers. I knew that. In the infamous secret history of European cults, the clan of Droom occupied a detestable eminence. During the great witchcraft craze of 300 years ago, when the king's soldiers came seeking the burrows in which the wizards lay hidden, Droom House was one of the first to be ransacked. For the Drooms presided over a truly terrible cult, and in their great cellars fully 30 members of the family died before the muskets of the outraged militia. And yet the house itself had survived. While thousands of ransacked dwellings had burned in those terrible nights, Droom House had been left gaunt and deserted, but untouched. Some of the Drooms escaped. Those surviving Drooms returned. The worship went on, but in secret now. The Drooms were a devout race, not easily moved to abandon their religious tenets. The house stood, and the faith stood, until this day. But now only Brian Droom remained of all the line. He lived alone in the old house, a reputed student of sorcery, who seldom attended the gatherings out on the hills where surviving believers still invoked the Black Father. My connection secured me an introduction, for I was greatly desirous of seeing the ancient dwelling and looking at certain inscriptions and designs which legend said were engraved on the stony walls of the cellars. Brian Droom, swarthy, bearded, burning-eyed, unforgettable. His personality was as compelling as a serpent's, and as evil. Generations had moulded him into the epitome of a sorcerer, a wizard, a seeker after things forbidden. The heritage of 400 years had made a wizard of Droom. In boyhood, he read the black books in his old house. In manhood, he walked the shadows of its halls in a palpable atmosphere of witchery. And yet, he was not a silent man. He could talk a blue streak, and was remarkably well-informed and well-educated. In a word, cultured. But he was not civilized. Brian Droom was a pagan, and when he spoke of his beliefs, he had the trusting manner of a fearless child. I met him several times at gatherings. Then I requested the pleasure of visiting him at his home. I had to wheedle, I admit, because he was damnably reluctant. On the excuse of showing him certain notes of my own, I at last obtained his grudging consent. Others expressed genuine amazement when I told them. It seems that Droom had never allowed strangers in the great house, was alone in the sense that he entertained no human company. So I called on Brian Droom. When I went, as I told you, I believed in witchcraft. Believed, that is, that the art had been practiced and had a scientific basis, although I did not concede that its achievements were in any way connected with the supernatural. But when I came in sight of the House of Droom, I began to change my mind. I didn't realize the full extent of the change until later, but even at the time, the first glimpse of Brian Droom's dwelling filled me with horror. The last words seemed to explode out of Will Banks. He went on, more softly than before. Now you must mark this. The house stood on a hillside against the bleeding sunset sky. It was a 2-story house, with twin gables on either side of a peaked roof. The house rose out of the hill like a gigantic head emerging from a grave. The gables were horns against the heavens. 2 jutting eaves were ears. The door was wide as a grinning mouth. There was an upper window on each side of the door. I won't tell you that the windows were like eyes. They were eyes. Through their narrow slits they peered at me, watched me approach. I felt it as I have never felt anything before, that this house, this century dwelling, possessed a life of its own, that it was aware of me, saw me, heard me coming. I walked up the path none the less, because I didn't know what was to come. I walked up, and the door opened, and Brian let me in. It opened, I tell you. Brian didn't open it. That was awful. It was just as though I had walked into a monster's head, a thinking monster's head. I could almost feel the brain buzzing about me, pulsing with thoughts as black as the shadows in the long, narrow, throat-like hallway through which we walked. Bear with me while I give you a few details. There was a long hall with a stairway at the further end, branching off into side rooms. The first side room to the left was the study Brian took me to. How well I know the geography of that house. Why shouldn't I know it? I see it every night in my dreams. We talked. Of course, it's important to remember what we talked about, but I really cannot recall. Brian, immensely forceful personality though he was, paled into insignificance beside the weight exerted by that ghastly house. If Brian Droom was the product of 12 generations, then this house was the 12 generations incarnate. It was something that had stood for 380 years, filled with life all that time, filled with evil life, filled with weird experiments, mad cries, hoarse prayers, and still hoarser answers. Hundreds of feet had trod its floors, hundreds of visitors had come and departed. Some, many in fact, had not departed, and of those, legend said that some had not been men. Blood had run in a slow, throbbing stream. And the house, not Brian Droom, but the house, was an aged person who had seen all of birth and life and death and what lay beyond. Here was the real wizard, the true viewer of all secrets. This house had seen it all. It lived, it leered down from the hill. While Brian talked and I automatically replied, I kept thinking of the house. This great study, a monstrous room filled with massive bookcases and long tables burdened with excess tomes. This great study with its olden oak furniture suddenly seemed in my mind's eye to be stripped of all extraneous objects. It became an empty room again, just a vast wooden expanse with huge timbers that formed the rafters overhead. I imagined it like that, dusty and deserted, robbed of all signs of visible habitation. Still, that damnable impression of life remained. An empty room here was never empty. The thought agitated me. It agitated me so much that I had to talk about it to Brian Droom. He smiled slowly. as I described my sensations. Then he spoke. "It is a much older house than even you imagine," he said, in his deep, burring voice. "I, who have dwelt here all my life, still do not know what further secrets it may possess. It was built originally by Cornac Droom in 1561. You may be interested in knowing that at this time the hill on which it stood supported several druidic stones, originally part of the circle pattern. Some of these were laid in the foundations, others still stand in the upper cellar. And another thing, my dear Banks, this house was not built, it accumulated. It was reared upward for 2 stories, that is true. The gables and eaves and roof were then as they are now, and the second floor remains unchanged. But the house had once only a single cellar. It was not until the faith prospered that we built again, and we built downward. We built downward, I say. Just as a church spire rears toward heaven, we of the faith appropriately builded toward our own kingdom. First a second cellar, and then a third. Finally passages under the hill for secret goings forth, when under duress. When Droom House was entered, the king's men never discovered the lower cellars, and that was well, for they would not have liked what they saw, being unbelievers and sacrilegious. Since then we have been wary of visitors, and the covens no longer meet. The lower cellars have fallen into disuse. Still, we have held many private ceremonies, for the Drooms had secret pacts of their own, requiring certain regular rites. But in the past 300 years, we in Droom House have lived together in solitude. Will Banks paused, drew breath. His lips twitched. He went on. I listened eagerly to his admissions concerning the cellars which I so desired to inspect. But something of his discourse puzzled me. His use of the word we interchangeably, so that at times it meant the family, at times himself, and at other times it actually seemed to imply the very house. He arose and stood by the wall, and I noted how his fingers softly caressed the ancient wood. It was not the caress of a connoisseur handling a rare tapestry, not the caress a master bestows upon a dog. It was the caress of a lover, the soft stroking motion of understanding and concealed desire. This old house and I understand one another. Droom bird. His smile held no humour. We take care of one another, even though today we're alone. Droom House protects me, even as I guard the secrets of Droom House. He stroked the woodwork gently. Banks paused again, swallowed hard, before continuing. By this time a revulsion had set in. Either I was mad or Brian Droom was. I wanted my information, and then I wanted to get out. I wanted to get out, I realized, because I never wanted to see this house again. I never wanted even to think about it again. And it wasn't the well-known fear of enclosed places. It wasn't claustrophobia, Doctor. I just couldn't stand the place, or rather the unnatural thoughts it aroused. But a stubbornness was in my soul. I did not want to leave without the information I had come for. I rather bungled things because of the unreasoning panic I felt. The unreasoning panic that rose in my heart as he lighted candles in the grey room and peopled the house with walking shadows. I asked him almost point blank if I could visit the cellars. I told him why, told him about inspecting certain symbols on the walls. He was standing by a candelabrum on the wall, lighting the waxen taper. As it flared up, a corresponding flare flamed in his eyes. "No, Will Banks," he said. "You cannot see the cellars of Droom House." Just that, and nothing more. The glare and the flat refusal. He gave no reason, he did not hint of mysteries I had no right to know. He did not threaten harm should I insist. No, not Brian Droom. But the house? The house did. The house hinted. The house threatened. The shadows seemed to coalesce on the walls, and a gathering oppression fell upon me, seized me in impalpable tentacles that strangled the soul. I cannot express it, save in this melodramatic wise. The house hated me. I was silent. I did not ask again. Brian Droom tugged at his black beard. His smile signified that the incident was closed. "You'll be going soon," he said. "Before that, a drink with me to stay your journey." He walked out of the room to prepare the drink. Then a mad impulse seized me, yet the impulse had reasons behind it. After all, I had come to Edinburgh solely for this end. For years I had studied, and here lay a clue I sorely needed. It was my only chance of obtaining the information I desired, and if the inscriptions were what I fancied, I could jot them down in a notebook in a moment. This was the first reason. The second was more complicated. The house, it threatened me. Like a mouse in the grip of a cat, I knew my doom, but could not keep still. I had to squirm, wriggle. Once deprived of Droom's company, even for a moment, panic gripped me like that cat, pouncing on the helpless mouse. I felt as though eyes were watching me, invisible claws extending on every hand. I was unable to remain in this room. I had to move. Of course I could have followed Brian Droom, but the other reason impelled me. I determined to enter the cellar. I rose quietly, on tiptoe, went down the hall. It was dark and still. Now, don't misunderstand. It wasn't haunted. This was not a mystery thriller mansion, with cobwebs and bats and creaking noises. It was merely dark, and the dark was old. Light hadn't shone here for 300 years, nor sane laughter broken the stillness. It was darkness that should have been dead, but it was alive, and it oppressed and terrified 1,000 times more than the sight of a ghost. I found myself trembling when I located the cellar door, with the steps below. The candle I had slipped into my pocket before leaving the study came into my hands, wet with sweat from my palms. I lit it and descended the stairs. I left the house's head and entered its heart. I'll be brief here. The cellar was huge, and there were many rooms, yet there was no dust. I won't go any further to describe the signs of life. There was a chapel and long walls with the symbols I sought, and an altar that undoubtedly must have been one of the druid stones Brian referred to. But I didn't notice that. I never did see what I came to see, because in the second chapel room I kept looking at the rafters, the long brown beams overhead against the cellar roof, the long brown beams with the great hooks on them, the great steel hooks, that held dangling things, white dangling things, human skeletons that gleamed as they hung in the breeze from the opened door, human skeletons still so new as to remain hanging articulated, new skeletons on hooks on the long brown rafters. There was blood on the floor and strips of flesh, and on the altar a thing still lay, not cleanly stripped yet. There was a vacant hook waiting, but the thing lay there on the altar before the black statue of Satan. And I thought of Brian Droom's mention of private rights still carried on by his family. I thought of his reticence concerning guests, and his refusal to allow me entrance to the cellar. I thought of the further cellars that lay below. If this were the heart of the house, what might lie beyond, in the soul? Then I looked back at the dancing skeletons that trod the air with bony feet and swung their gleaming arms as they grinned down on me in mockery. They hung on the rafters of the House of Droom, and the House of Droom guarded them as one guards a secret. The House of Droom was with me in the cellar, watching me, waiting for my reaction. I dared not show it. I stood there, in fancy, feeling forces quiver about me. Forces radiating from the blood-stained walls, forces bursting from the outlandish designs cut in the stones, forces rising from the floor, from depths still further below. Then I felt human eyes. Brian Droom stood in the doorway. Banks was now on his feet. His eyes were staring. He was reliving the scene. I threw the candle and struck him in the face with the burning end. Then I snatched up the unmentionable basin from the altar top, and I hurled it at his head. He went down. I was upon him then, desperately tearing at his throat. I had to act first, because when he had stood there in the doorway, I had seen the knife in his hand. A cutting knife, a sewing knife. And I remembered the thing still lying on the altar. That was why I moved first. And now I was wrestling with him on the stone floor, trying to wrest the knife away. I was no match for him. He was a giant, and he picked me up and carried me to the center of the room, carried me toward the vacant hook that gleamed in the line of skeletons. Its steel barb projected outward, and I knew he meant to hang me there. My hands fought for that knife as he forced me down that grinning line of eyeless watchers. He lifted me high, until my head was on a level with his own madly distorted face. Then my hands found his wrist. Desperation gave me strength. I drove his wrenched arm back, upward. The knife entered his belly in one great thrust. The force spun him around, and he fell back. His own neck caught against the steel hook hanging from the rafter. As his great arms released me, he was pinioned. Blood gushed from his corded throat as I plunged the knife home again and again. He died there, on the hook, and he mumbled, "The curse of my house upon you." I heard the curse through red hazes of madness. It was not dramatically impressed on my mind. Then, instead, there was only the gnawing horror of our struggle and his death. The fear which caused me to race up those steps without turning back, grope through darkness to the study, and set fire to the house. Yes, I burned Droom House, as one burns a witch or warlock, as they destroyed wizards in the olden days. I burned Droom House so that fire might purify and flame consume the evil that leaped at me as I ran out of the blazing dwelling. I swear the flames nearly trapped me as I ran, although they had only risen a moment before. I swear I clawed at the door as though it were a living thing that grappled with me, seeking to hold me back. Only when I stood below the hill and watched the red glow arise did I remember Brian's words, "The curse of my house upon you." I thought of them as the door broke into a gash of scarlet flame, and when the people came and clustered about, I still remained, heedless of danger, until I saw the walls of that accursed mansion crumble into glowing ash, and the place of evil destroyed forever. Then I knew peace, for a while. But now, Doctor, I'm haunted. Will Banks's voice became a whisper. I left Edinburgh at once, dropped my studies. I had to, of course. Fortunately, I was not incriminated in the affair, but my nerves had been shattered. I was on the verge of a true psychotic condition. I was advised to travel, regain my health and strength to fortify my mental outlook. So I travelled. In England I saw it first. I was spending a week with friends at Manchester. They had a country place just outside the industrial town. We rode about the estate one afternoon, and I lagged behind to rest my horse. It was about sunset when I rounded a bend and saw the hill. The sky was red above it. I saw the hill first, and then something grew on it. It grew. You've read about ghosts, Doctor, about how they manifest themselves with ectoplasm. They say it's like watching a picture come out in the solution in which a print is developed. It comes gradually, takes shape. The colours fill in. It was the house that did that. Droom House. Slowly, wavering lines grew solid as I recognized the damnable head that leered out of the hillside. The window eyes were red with slanted sunlight, and they looked straight at me. "Come in, Wilbanks," they invited. I stared for a full minute, blinking and hoping with all my heart that the vision would go away. It didn't. Then I spurred my horse to a gallop and fled down the road to my friends, never looking back. "Who lives on the hill?" I gasped. Jessens, the banker friend I was staying with, gave me a look. Even before he spoke, I knew. "No one," he said. "Trying to pull my leg, are you?" I kept still, but I left the next day. Went to the Alps. No, I didn't see the Droom House on the Matterhorn. I had a good solid 6 months of peace, but on the train back to Marseille, I looked out of the window at sunset, and there it was. "Come in, Wilbanks," the eyes invited. I turned away. That same night I went to Naples. After that, it was a race. For 6 months, 8 months at a time, I seemed safe. But if sunset found me near a hillside, be it in Norway or Burma, the damned vision reoccurred. I've put it all down. 21 times in the past 10 years. I grew clever enough about it all. After the 3rd or 4th manifestation, I realized that this combination of sunset and hillside was necessary to produce the image. For ghost, I would not admit it was. I avoided being out in the open after dusk began. But in the last year or so, I've grown more hopeless. Travel has proved fruitless. I cannot escape it. Naturally, the story has remained with me alone. I dared not tell anyone, and several occasions served to convince me that nobody saw the apparition save myself. What has frightened me is the later developments of the thing. Now, when I force myself to gaze steadily at the house, I see it for a longer and longer time, and each time, this in the last 3 years, I've finally computed, that house appears nearer and nearer to the spot where I am standing. Don't you understand what it means? Sooner or later I shall be before the house at the very door, and one sunset I may find myself inside under the long brown rafters with the hooks and Brian all bloody and the house waiting for me. Nearer and nearer. Yet God knows I'm always on the road when I see it up there on the hill, but I get closer to it every time, and if I enter that place of ghosts, I know something waits for me. The spirit of that house. Wilbanks did not stop of his own accord. I stopped him. "Shut up," I rapped sharply. "What?" "Shut up," I repeated. "Now listen to me, Wilbanks. I've listened to you, and I haven't commented. I expect the same courtesy in return." He calmed down at once, as I knew he would. I was not a psychiatrist for nothing, and psychiatrists know when to let their patients talk and when to shut them up. "I've listened to you," I said, without any jibes about witchcraft or fantasies. "Now suppose you listen to my theories, with the same respect. To begin with, you're suffering from a common obsession. Nothing serious, just a common, everyday obsession. A cousin to the one that makes a habitual drunkard see pink elephants, even when not actually suffering from delirium tremens. Banks bridled. I stared him down. It's undoubtedly a symptom of a guilt complex, I said matter-of-factly. You killed a man named Brian Droom. Don't bother to deny it. We'll admit it. We won't go into the motives. We won't even examine justification. You killed Brian Droom under very peculiar circumstances. Something about the house in which the deed occurred was strongly impressed upon your susceptible subconscious mind. In a state of tension following the killing, you fired the house. In your subconscious, the destruction of the house loomed as a greater crime than the destruction of the man. Right? It did, Doctor. It did, Banks wailed. The house had a life of its own, a concentrated life that was greater than that of a single person. That house was Brian Droom and all his wizard ancestors. It was evil, and I destroyed it. Now it seeks vengeance. Wait a minute, I drawled. Wait a minute. You're not telling me, I'm telling you. All right. In consequence of your guilty feelings, this complex has arisen. This hallucination is a mental projection of your own guilt, a symptom of the weight you felt while keeping the story a secret. Understand? In psychoanalysis, we have come to refer to confession as a cathartic method, whereby the patient is often relieved of mental difficulties by merely telling frankly the story of his troubles. Confession is good for the soul. It may be that all of your problem has been solved by simply unburdening yourself to me here. If not, I shall endeavor to probe more deeply. There are some things I wish to learn regarding your association with the witchcraft cults. I will need to find out certain details of your mental attitude, regarding superstitions and the like. Don't you see? Banks muttered. You can't understand. This is real. You must know the supernatural as I do. There is no supernatural, I stated. There is merely the natural. If one speaks of supernatural, one might as well speak of the subnatural, a manifest absurdity. Extensions of physical laws I grant, but such things merely occur in a disordered brain. I don't care what you believe, Banks said. Help me, Doctor. Only help me. I can't bear it much longer. Believe that. I would never have come to you otherwise. Even drugs won't keep me from dreaming. Wherever I go, I see that cursed house rising up out of hills, grinning at me and beckoning. It gets nearer and nearer. Last week I saw it here, in America. 400 years ago it rose in Edinburgh. I burnt it 10 years ago. Last week I saw it very close. I was only 15 feet away from the door, and the door was open. Help me, Doctor. You must. I will. Pack your things, Banks. You and I are going fishing. What? You heard me. Be ready at noon tomorrow. I'll bring the car around. I have a little lodge up in the Berkshires, and we can put in a week or so of loafing around. Meanwhile, I'll get a slant at you. You'll have to cooperate, of course, but we'll discuss those details later. Here now, just do as I say. And I think if you try a tablespoonful of this in some brandy tonight before you go to bed, you won't have any more house parties in your dreams. Noon tomorrow, then. Goodbye. It was noon the next day. Banks wore a grey suit and a nervous frown. He didn't feel like talking, that was evident. I chatted gaily, laughed a lot at my own stories, and swung the car up through the hills all afternoon. I had it all planned out in my own mind, of course. The first notes on the case were down. I'd handle him easily the first few days, watch him for betraying signs, and then really get to work from the analytical side. Today I could afford to put him at ease. We drove on, Banks sitting silent, until the shadows came. "Stop the car." "Eh?" "Stop it. It's getting towards sunset." I drove on, unheeding. He shouted. He threatened. I hummed. The redness deepened in the west. Then he began to plead. "Please stop. I don't want to see it. Go back. Go back. There's a town we just passed. Let's stay there. Please, I can't bear to see it again. Close. Doctor, for God's sake." "We'll arrive in half an hour," I said. "Don't be a child. I'm with you." I piloted the car between the green borders of the encircling hills. We headed west against the fading sun. It shone redly on our faces, but Banks was white as a sheet beneath its glare as he cowered in the seat beside me. He mumbled under his breath. All at once, his body tensed, and his fingers dug into my shoulder with maniacal strength. "Stop the car!" he screamed. I applied the brakes. He was cracking. "There it is!" he yelled, with something that was almost triumph in his voice, something masochistic, as though he welcomed the ordeal to come. There's the house on that hill. Do you see it? There!" Of course, it was just a bare hillside, some 50 feet back from the road. "It's grinning!" he cried. "Droom is watching me. Look at the windows. They wait for me." I watched him closely as he moved out of the car. Should I stop him? No, of course not. Perhaps if he went through with it this time, he'd throw off his obsession. At any rate, if I could observe the incident, I might get the clues necessary to unraveling the threads of his twisted personality. Let him go. It was awful to watch, I admit it. He was screaming about the House of Droom and the curse as he went up the hillside. Then I noticed that he was sleepwalking, self-hypnotized. In other words, Banks didn't know he was moving. He thought he was still in the car. That explained his story of how each time the imaginary house seemed closer. He unconsciously approached the focal point of his hallucination, that was all. Like an automaton, he strained up the green grade. "I'm at the door," he shouted. "It's close. God, Doctor, it's close. The damned thing is creeping toward me, and the door is open. What shall I do?" "Go inside," I called. I wasn't sure he could hear me in his state, but he did. I counted on such an action to break the thread for him, watched his reactions carefully. His tall form was silhouetted against the sunset as he walked, and now one hand reached out. His feet rose as though crossing an actual threshold. It was, I admit it, horrible to watch. It was the grotesque pantomime beneath a scarlet sky, the mimicry of a madman. "I'm inside now. Inside!" Banks's voice rose with fear. "I can feel the house all around me. Alive. I can see it." Without knowing it, I too, compelled by a fear I could not name, had left the car. I started for the hill. "Stay with it, Banks," I called. "I'm coming." "The hall is dusty," Banks mumbled. "Dusty. It would be after 10 years of desertion. 10 years ago it burned. The hall is dusty. I must see the study." As I watched in revulsion, Banks walked precisely along the hilltop, turned as though in a doorway, and entered. Yes, I said entered. Something that wasn't there. "I'm here," he muttered. "It's the same, but it's dark. It's too dark, and I can feel the house. I want to get out." He turned again and made an exit. "It won't let me go." That scream sent me scrambling up the hillside. "I can't find the door now. I can't find it, I tell you. It's locked me in. I can't get out. The house won't let me. I must see the cellar first, it says. It says I must see the cellar." He turned and walked precisely, sickeningly, around a bend. A hand opened an imaginary door, and then, did you ever see a man walk down non-existent stairs? I did. It halted me on my charge up the hillside. Will Banks stood on the hill at sunset, walking down cellar stairs that were not there. And then he began to shriek. "I'm here in the cellar, and the long brown beams are still overhead. They are here too. They are hanging, grinning. And why, it's you, Brian, on the hook where you died. You're still bleeding, Brian Droom, after all these years, still bleeding on the floor. Mustn't step in the blood. Blood. Why are you smiling at me, Brian? You are smiling, aren't you? But then, you must be alive. You can't be. I killed you. I burned this house. You can't be alive, and the house can't be alive. What are you going to do?" I had to get up the hill. I couldn't stand hearing him shriek such things into empty air. I had to stop him now. "Brian," he shrieked, "you're getting down off the hook. No, the beam is falling. The house, I must run. Where are the cellar steps? Where are they? Don't touch me, Brian. The beam fell down, and you're free, but keep away from me. I must find the steps. Where are they? The house is moving. No, it's crumbling." I made the top of the hill, panting. Banks screamed on, and then his hands went out. "God, the house is falling. It's falling on me. Help! Let me out! The things on the brown beams are holding me. Let me out! The beams are falling. Help! Let me out!" Suddenly, just before my outstretched hands could reach him, Banks flung up his arms as though to ward off an impending blow, then crumpled to the grass. I knelt at his side. Of course, I did not enter a house to do it. It was under the dying sun that I gazed into his pain-contorted face and saw that he was dead. It was under a dying sun that I lifted the body of Will Banks and saw that his chest had been crushed as though by a falling beam. The Secret of the Vault by J. Wesley Rosenquest. I think it was in January that my suspicions first took form and grew. Prior to that, my uncle's visits to the family burial vault had only the appearance of actions natural to grief, and, as on all occasions he carried with him into the cold depths a candle and missal, I presumed his intentions to be only the most pious. In all his words to me concerning the matters of the deceased, he exhibited a tender reverence and profound respect for those he called the immortal spirits. As he said, it was not until the recent death and burial of his wife, my Aunt Helena, that he became aware and fully conscious of another world, and the need of the dead for prayer. This I believed. Even had I suspected earlier, I could not disprove his words, as out of a timid heart I had never ventured into the mortuary chambers deep below the cellar. From childhood I had held in my mind an image of supreme gruesomeness, in which the antique burial vaults in my childish imagination yawned like some ravenous maw, into which all who vanished never returned. In fancy I constructed a bottomless pit, in which nightmarish forms of darkness crept and grew, a pit filled with forms instilled with a grim life that was an insult flung in the face of God and nature. Death itself held no terrors for me, but only those things which I conceived to be the offspring of death in the imagination-infested region of my childhood, which I associated inseparably with the vaults. During many of my earlier years, I dwelt morbidly on the subject of what happens to the deceased. Perversely, I gave no thought to paradise or the place where flew the immortal spirit, but farther reflected on the husk left behind, and the possibility of an abnormal awareness, a sluggish and impotent life clinging thereto, defying time and dissolution, impotent only in that it was static, and could not manifest itself. I filled my boyish mind with terrible subjects. I had read, I think in my 12th year, of suspended animation, and wondered what was the difference between death from which there was return and death from which there was no return, and if there was an awareness of surroundings in the poor, crumbling shell. I would stand at the head of the narrow, steep stone stairway, holding the heavy oaken door wide open, and ready to flee in an instant, gazing fearsomely into a darkness that defied my penetrating stare. And I felt that my gaze was reciprocated. I was above all things conscious of a curious air of watchfulness that seemed to justify my intuition of an unnatural vitality residing in those who dwelt there. I knew that there was not mere annihilation, but a transformation into something that was neither annihilation nor true life, a vitality that oozed from and through the dissolving shells, thriving amidst decay and darkness with sickening tenacity. Then, when some member of my once large family descended the narrow stairway, I stood with fixed and fascinated stare, straining to catch a glimpse of the nitrous interior, but seeing only the damp, grey-gleaming walls of a passageway that led still further down. And always the feeble reflections of the taper would yield once more to darkness as the visitant progressed into the vaults, so that it seemed that the ravening maw was indeed filled, satisfied. As I grew older, I witnessed the fateful procession of my family into the vaults. So it came about finally that those who frequented the grim limbo that filled my early years with a superstitious terror failed to return from the black depths below the basement. The living, who had descended so often to pray for the already departed, themselves surrendered to the encroachment of death on the domain of the living. I personified the vaults as a creeping form, a restless entity burrowing beneath the big old house, waiting patiently for the stream of the living that passed as inevitably into the still chambers as the stars progressed in their courses. I often wondered if we do not commit a terrible error by not cremating the dead. Instead, they are placed in vaults and coffins as things no longer animate, without feeling or consciousness. They are put away whole and intact as they died, and time wreaks its will upon them. Perhaps we are mistaken to think that life departs abruptly and completely from the mortal frame, and as greatly in error to attempt to draw a distinct line between organic and inorganic, sentient and insentient, living and dead. There are certainly degrees of life and vitality in human beings. In all cases, then, does this vitality depart sharply and cleanly, instead of ebbing away slowly after the abrupt slump called death? The fact that the bodies of saints so often remain intact for long years has led me to suspect that they do not enjoy their heavenly reward as soon as might be expected after death. There are many cases of suspended animation or catalepsy. At times, the victims awake before they're interred and are saved from live burial. Others are not so fortunate. Who can say where catalepsy tapers off into deeper shades or tones of death? And how deep may the deceased descend into the clouded abyss? If vitality is a fluid, how many drops cling to the interior of the vessel when it is emptied? My Aunt Helena was a vigorous woman. She was not very tall or heavy or muscular, and yet she possessed that strange force or essence called vitality in superabundance. How can we define this? Neither physiology nor chemistry could ever explain what it was that she, more than anyone else I knew except my uncle, emanated continuously during her busy life. I have heard that the human organism emanates a fluid or force deadly to certain minute organisms, and capable of affecting delicate instruments. I wonder if this fluid is identical with what is called the soul. Horrible thought! If this is so, the soul must be divisible. It is then constantly radiating out into space, leaving its traces here and there, like the slimy trail left behind by the snail. Where is immortality, then? For when the restraining vessel disintegrates, the fluid flows away in all directions and evaporates. My aunt was a fair, light-haired, blue-eyed woman. Her features were fine and delicately proportioned, and her form willowy. Therefore, when I speak of her abounding vitality, I think not of the crude strength of the peasant woman, but the subtle radiations of the full moon, the glow of subterranean fires, the concealed potency of the magnet, and the incorporeal energy of the winds. She was the paragon of force and magnetism, of energy that was not born of bone or muscle. She emanated a persuasive magnetism that influenced all about her, a will that bent all before her like wind in the wheat fields. Life seemed to flow from her high, white forehead and her slender fingertips. She was constantly in the best health, and never seemed subject to the maladies that sweep the frail human frame. Her day was filled with activity from dawn to sunset. I remember her today, not as she appeared in the lily glow about the bier, but as she used to move about through the house and in the gardens, leaving her impress on the very walls, her breath on the flowers and shrubs. It was a great shock when she died suddenly, on a chill December night, without warning and without apparent cause. The family physician ascribed her demise to heart failure, but I knew that this verdict was a mockery. It was impossible that she had died from a heart ailment, as she had never shown symptoms of such a malady. Later, I was to understand. If her death was a shock to me, it was an even greater shock to my uncle. So it seemed, for she was the center of his universe. Where formerly there were 3 of us in the great house, there were now only 2. The house became suddenly and completely empty, cold, cheerless. Under my aunt's hands it had slowly acquired, during the years after the death of my parents, a warmth and vitality that it must certainly have absorbed from her. The furniture gleamed, ornaments sparkled, the fire burned with fierce joy in the great fireplace. After her death, the gleam and the sparkle and the joy suddenly went out, like an extinguished candle, plunging the house into a gloom that weighed down on the roof. All the life and vitality that the place had absorbed under Aunt Helena's care departed with her, was imprisoned in the coffin, casting a last glow on the massed white lilies, and flowed away into the burial vaults like water seeking its lowest level, leaving its former level bleak and dry. Was it for this reason that, after her death, the vaults acquired a new, shall we call it, life? To me, the pitch-black mortuary chambers below the cellar took on a new atmosphere, a new significance. The darkness squirmed, thrived with life, seemed to course fluidly through the grimly tenanted subterranean rooms. It was not the same pit of my childhood, where formerly I felt only a sluggish, terrible awareness lurking in the abysmal obscurity of the vaults. There was now an abounding vitality, a burning flame of unexampled brightness, as the torch dims the fitful glow of the ignis fatuus. It was Aunt Helena who, I knew, was resisting somehow the sharp fang of the conqueror worm with the superhuman vital force that must have dwelt latent, not destroyed, in her still form, pushing outward against its concrete prison. After her death, I was again subjected to the morbid fascination of my childhood days. I stood in fright and awe at the head of the steep, narrow stone stairway, gazing into the well of darkness at the foot of the damp, mossy steps. I did this often, the strange spell holding me with a grip of iron, and still I did not dare to descend. I stood ready to flee in an instant, holding the ponderous oaken door wide on its massive copper hinges, powerless to descry anything in the gloomy recesses of the vaults, and, indeed, not knowing what I should expect to see. And I felt undeniably the presence of Helena. As always, I felt where I could not see. Uncle Henry seemed grief-stricken, which was to be expected. Yet I say, seemed. I remember his iron composure at the funeral, and at the placing of the coffin in the vault. I watching on, and not daring to follow the slow procession of pallbearers headed by my uncle, who carried candelabra to light the precipitous descent and the murky path. Then later, I observed him in the library by the fireplace, his head unbowed. The heavy odor of lilies filled the air, the wind whispered drearily outside the windows, light and shadow writhed on the walls like a misty simulacrum of Tartarian vistas. Still he sat there, surrounded by a subtle aura of confidence, of expectation. How was I to guess so soon? In the days that followed, in the weeks that grew out of them, I observed with growing curiosity my uncle's excessively frequent visits to the tomb, always with the missal and single candle. As often as once each day I saw his heavy, muscular form descending into the blackness with slow and steady steps. In the weeks following the death of his wife, my uncle's bearing and demeanour became more and more confident and expectant, quite different from his earlier, assumed air of resignation to the will of God. His vigils beside the tomb of Helena were frequent, as I have said, yet he returned each time from the vaults with the utmost composure, with ill-concealed confidence on his rugged face, although I did not perceive this immediately. In the latter days of January, he was almost cheerful. He moved with a brisk step, yet with a great air of mystery. Still I suspected nothing, for whenever we spoke with each other, the restrained, sadness-tinged tones of his voice dispelled such perplexity as had grown from observation of his actions. The first intimation of horror that I received came to me one evening in the hushed atmosphere of his private library, to which no one but him and Aunt Helena had ever had access. He had always spent a considerable part of each day in his room and in his library. On 2 occasions only had I ever caught a glimpse of the ceiling-high shelves. A glimpse and no more. Naturally, I had always felt curiosity about the book-lined room. One day, my curiosity was to receive more satisfaction than I had bargained for. It was on a Sunday, and I had already seen my uncle disappear down the slippery steps into the strangely vibrant darkness. It was on my way to the study that I halted beside the door of Uncle Henry's private library. Who can say what it was that impelled me to try the doorknob? Perhaps it was the old curiosity, perhaps it was caprice, or perhaps I was prompted by something deeper. Then it was that I received the first intimation in that heavily silent environment. On the shelves was a staggering collection of books, which I perceived immediately with a growing apprehension dealt with subjects I felt to be violently incompatible with his professed religious views. Words cannot express my shock, my bewilderment, my doubt upon examining the numerous volumes. Many were inscribed in Latin, and were of great antiquity. Those I could not read, however, usually contained remarkable and grotesque diagrams and drawings, interlaced triangles, squares, and circles, and charts of the human anatomy covered with astrological and cabalistic symbols appeared frequently in these works. Then, too, there were those books that I could read, and I proceeded to do so at the cost of completely lost equilibrium. Picking out a heavy, leather-bound volume, I opened it and began to read. My fright was great. Consider, for example, the following. "It is said among the Greeks," said the paragraph, it was apparently translated from Latin, "that in an impenetrable mountain fastness in the northeast, where Rome's legions have not yet penetrated, dwells a scattered people whose priests and physicians are unexcelled in necromancy and the control of the elements. Frightened and starved travelers have returned from this mountain region with strangely similar tales. Accounts of the raising of the dead and of lightning and wind called out of the heavens are frequent. It has also been said that these people stand unclothed in bitter cold and melt ice and snow around them with the breath of their bodies. It seems that these strange people, whoever they may be, are the custodians of a very great fund of superhuman wisdom and hold the keys to many arcana. The tree-worshipping priests of Britannia and the black men of the southern continent hold no powers such as these. The soothsayers of the Greeks and the oracles of Delphi are acquainted with mere child's games when one considers the many times confirmed accounts of the occult might of these people. The above, however, was the least of the abominations that I found. It took on the appearance of a mere dissertation on the customs of foreign peoples in strange places, compared to that which next occupied my dazed brain, next absorbed my horror-filled intensity of concentration. Opening a large, leather-bound tome at random, I read, "It is therefore apparent that each soul possesses inherent in itself to effect its own resurrection, a capacity for the special vital fluid possessed by the human organism, 1,000-fold greater than the crude, earthy strength of the animal world. In the human being alone is the solar force specialized, differentiated into what might be called mental or spiritual vital force, in contradistinction to the physical vitality of animals and the sluggish animation of vegetable life. In this respect, men are the vessels of power, the most exalted receptacles of the precious fluid that flows from the plenum of the golden dew of Pleroma, otherwise known to men as Anima Mundi. Behold, then, how each man may resurrect his own body according to the archetype of Christos, and triumph over the destroyer of forms. The secret lies in this, that he who aspires to unending length of days must invoke that power known as the Preserver, and the secret is that each man is his own preserver. By knowledge of the proper means, therefore, one may overthrow the night-clothed and ravening devourer which forces its way into the most secret tomb, the most cleverly concealed vault, to gnaw at the husk therein. The soul may wrench itself from the smothering embrace of night, from the detestable bosom of decay, from the cold and slimy suck of chaos, and radiant and triumphant, emerge from the gaping entrance of its shattered prison, invested with immortality of the body. For it is the terrifying truth, there is no other immortality. That which men call the immortality of the spirit is a dim dream, and the soul without a body flits like a will-o'-the-wisp from star to star. Certain Oriental peoples have a method of arousing the dead, wherein the veins of the body are opened, and the corpse is cudgelled violently with sticks and flogged with whips, so that a frantic, convulsive, and temporary revivification is brought about. This is hardly to be admired, or less yet to be indulged in, for it is not true immortality, and is a cruel disappointment to the eager, reawakened entity to which the body belongs. There is a more subtle, sure method, however, by which animation may be restored to the dead, provided that the period of latency in the tomb does not exceed 7 days, or slightly more or less than that figure. The blasphemous tract thereupon gave minute directions for the raising of the dead. It spoke confidently, in the utmost detail, about the necessary measures, the arrangement of censers and diagrams, of candles and emblems around and above the tomb, and the intricate, sonorous mantras to be intoned daily in the funereal environs, accompanied by slow-traced diagrams and signs in the air. I closed the book slowly, confusedly, my fingers trembling with a dawning fear. Then I placed the volume back in its proper place, extinguished the light, and fled from the library, closing the door swiftly, silently, behind me. As I hurried to my room, I heard slow, heavy footsteps ascending the stairs from the cellar. I considered myself fortunate indeed to have escaped observation, as a terrible suspicion had crept into my mind concerning the true purpose of my uncle's vigils in the vaults. In the seemingly endless days that followed my intrusion into the locked library of my uncle, it was only with almost superhuman exertion of will that I concealed from him, in word or even general bearing, the fact that I had received the first intimation of abnormality in his daily actions, the fact that I had penetrated into the monstrous repository of occult knowledge into which he withdrew daily for study that did not pursue the conventional paths of learning. I would not have succeeded in this deception had I known the measure in which he was succeeding in necromancy, though it must be understood that my suspicions were still so unformed that I could not assign any definite purpose to his frequent descents into the funereal chambers deep below the house. I observed my uncle's actions thereafter with such intensity that his failure to feel my gaze was miraculous. This concentration brought to my attention things I had failed to observe before, such as long bulges beneath his clothing, betokening, as I was later to discover, a candle made for ceremonial purposes, and small packages that left in the air fragrant trails of sandalwood and frankincense. Always, however, he carried with him the single candle, the weighty missal, which repeated action became obnoxious to me, as I now knew that he had no need or use for a book of orthodox prayer. It seemed to me at times that I could also hear faint echoes of my uncle's voice in the depths below, a voice whose timbre had acquired a new significance. What was it that caused him to become so negligent of his actions in those last few days? What inspired the carelessness that led to my ultimate discovery of the events that had been going on in the vaults? Truly, it was merciful that the truth became known to me bit by bit, rather than in one moment that would have cost me my sanity. First, there was his curiously confident, expectant air as he emerged daily from the vaults. Then followed the discovery of the library and of the packages that he carried with him into the depths. And finally, that last day, I found the diary, which led to the ultimate climax of revelation in the subterranean rooms into which I finally dared to descend. Entering my uncle's room unbidden, while he was absorbed in his daily subterrane vigil, I found the diary on his dresser. Without knowing what to expect, I opened and read. December 23rd. It is now 7 days after the interment of Helena, and I have begun the rites of preservation which are necessary to preserve the temple from destruction. For it will be many days before the marble chrysalis yields up its precious secret, before the final and glorious resurrection of her who lies so pallid but adamant within. I doubt that the rites could recall her to me without her own innate power of resurrection. The force she had in life she now has in death, subdued and concealed, but flouting conqueror worm with sublime persistency. How can I express the deep humility I feel upon observing daily her imperishable form, white and spotless, unmarked by the tooth of time? In tender reverence and awe I am compelled to genuflect before her quiet immortality, her adamant but subdued and gentle will to life. Her hair seems to flow like a golden river in the darkness of the vault, and a faint nimbus clothes her resisting flesh in a secret and unearthly glamour. Her blue gem eyes are now softly veiled by white rose lids, but they shall soon open. I tremble in passion like a leaf in a gale as I stand daily in the circle of glowing tapers, intoning magical syllables in the hushed atmosphere, swinging the censer rhythmically, while her still form is wreathed in plumes of pungent frankincense and sandalwood. What a strange passion I am filled with when I view her dormant beauty. It seems to me that now she is more desirable, being for the moment beyond my reach, and I, a humble votary, wreathe the marble goddess with incense. What a strange feeling! I am sure she is aware of my presence, though she is truly dead. I feel some strange and supermundane breath of air flow from the sepulchre, as out of vast spaces. A foolish thought. It is as still as death down there, as still as death can be. There is only silence and darkness, and Helena waits patiently in the midst of her gruesome company, until the day shall arrive when she strides forth from the tomb. The burning incense drops for the moment a veil before her radiance. December 27th. The past days have been filled with a sweet anxiety, an ecstatic impatience. Although I repeat the mantras precisely and trace the diagrams unfailingly, it seems to me that I am not the occult scientist I thought myself, but a bereaved spouse frantically imploring, rather than demanding, the return of his loved one. At the end of the ceremony, I unfailingly kneel in adoration before the sepulchre, while my hot and quickened breath congeals on the grey stone. Grey, grey stone covered with sweat and nitre, the enclosing darkness. These I could not bear but for the presence of Helena. Her calm demeanour soothes and refreshes me immeasurably. How cosmic her thoughts must be, how superhuman and unearthly her mood as she lies there. January 2nd. The supermundane wind again. I feel it flow from the shrouded recesses of the vault, and yet the candles do not flicker. The plumes of incense do not waver. But I think I understand now. It is the breath of Anima Mundi. It is the stirring of the breath of life. It is a psychic wind, and has its origin nowhere on earth, although it flows through Helena, who is a gate ajar to the interstellar forces and the thronging multitudes beyond the veil of matter. Hasten! January 7th. How long must I wait? How long must we wait? O cruel time, thy fangs are sharp, they bite deeply. And although thy strength is nothing against her, thy tooth has torn my heart. Helena, doubt, prayer, incantations, waiting, incense mingling with the musty effluvium of the tomb, pungent, aromatic, 7 candles, tall and quietly burning, colored diagrams in chalk on dank grey stone, silence, silence, then the sonorous chant of resurrection. When will it end? Perhaps. But God preserve me, I dare not doubt. Until now I have had naught but the utmost confidence in the revelations of Ibn Khanu in his work Death and Resurrection. I must not now doubt the potency of the mantras and the symbols, nor Helena's own indomitable will. Long days and weeks have passed since her death, while I have spent every day either beside her tomb or in my library, learning how to hasten the transformation of the human chrysalis, how to break the suna, the marble and mortar cocoon. Endless incantations, dozens of ceremonial candles, a fortune in rare frankincense. What are all these to the price Helena and I would pay if I failed? Her sacrifice was sublime. She was not informed as I was in the occult lore of ages. She knew nothing of the greater arcana. Yet she consented so readily, so willingly, with such sublime confidence in my ability to bring her forth again from the tomb. Not the slightest remonstrance, not the least doubt, and of fear there was none. I but explained to her my intention, my glorious purpose of immortality on earth, and though she did not understand fully, she bowed her head and gave her consent sweetly. She knew what she was to do that night at the table, and she did it without hesitation, faced death without fear. 2 brownish drops in the wine I placed at dinner, bitter. She drank it swiftly. Helena. Hours later I stumbled up flights of stairs, raced in engulfing fear through the empty house, through long, silent corridors that seemed without end, through great hushed rooms wherein a strange animation seemed to have sprung up, past fireplaces leaping with fiery life and walls alive with writhing shadows, through portals that seemed to fly open before my approach in a terror of their own, and out into the cold January air. Snow was falling outside, thick and fast. I fled up the side of a hill, and, reaching the summit, paused there, while my gaze rested on the huge rambling house below, from which I had just flung myself in an overwhelming access of terror. Beneath me it lay like a slumbering behemoth, while the dull greyness of the walls and the roof was transformed into a living, gleaming white, and the light within blazed brazenly and triumphantly out over the rime-blanketed earth. Light sprang into fiery life in every window, lit by an unseen incendiary. The great, snow-bleached structure became suddenly vibrant with light, life. The howling night wind shrieked triumphantly, and my mind projected itself once more inside. The pageant of past minutes rose up before me. Gone now was all the old terror of my childhood, replaced by an overwhelming, torturing curiosity. Dazedly, hardly realizing what I was doing, I opened the ponderous oaken door slowly, silently, on its well-oiled copper hinges. With silent tread, and with a pace of funereal slowness and deliberation, I descended the precipitous, grey, dank steps. Dark, wet walls loomed up on either side, and thick blackness lay before me at the bottom of the descent. A cold, clammy breath blew in my face from the rambling chambers and corridors into which I was venturing at last, heavily laden with the odour of freshly burned incense. And as I reached the bottom of the stone stairway, and stood quivering in the frigid exhalation of the vault, there beat against my ears the strangely arousing syllables of a low-pitched, vibrant chant. It roamed through the obscurity of the chambers, and smote my attentive ears with a peculiar, invigorating quality. Still hardly realizing that I had made the fearsome descent into this chill limbo, I proceeded through the twisting corridor unhesitatingly, as if my feet and legs were inspired with a volition and animation of their own. Suddenly, I came to a turn in the corridor, and there spread before me the first room, within a circle of 7 candles, whose light beat in visible pulsations against the enclosing darkness. Within, a complex diagram made with chalk on the wet flagstones, wrapped in clouds and plumes of incense arising from 3 senses, knelt my uncle, gazing with a fearful concentration into the recessed vault immediately in front of him. The last syllables flowed from his lips, and then he uttered softly, reverently, yet passionately, "Helena! Helena!" I had halted there at the turn in the passageway, frozen in statuesque immobility, while comprehension dawned luridly on my dazed mind, while the blood withdrew violently from my face, the strength from my limbs, the first courage from my sadly leaping heart. Myself unseen, I watched the mute unfolding of the ultimate climax. My extremities grew cold, my head flushed again with blood, then blanched once more. My pulse raced violently, swiftly. I seemed suddenly suspended in the outer depths of space, while the earth dwindled beneath me like a punctured balloon. My consciousness reeled, but fortunately did not leave me, so that I was able to creep from the corridor to the stairs and up them to the silent quarters above in abject fear. I heard my uncle's expectant cry, and would have turned and fled. Too late. Aunt Helena emerged from the vault slowly, quietly, with a queer delicacy. I never returned to that house. The Crawling Horror by Thorp McClusky. 1. I am about to set down on paper a sequence of indisputable happenings. At some of the incidents I was personally present, and the story of the others has come to me through the testimony of unimpeachable and trustworthy witnesses. I am a country physician, having practiced in this single village all my life, as, indeed, my father did before me. The people here are farmers, mostly of Dutch or German descent, with a few Poles and Lithuanians. About 2 miles beyond the village, Hans Ludwig Brubaker had his farm. The farm is still there, and it is worked by relatives, but Hans has gone. No one definitely knows where or what he is. We can only guess. Hans lived there alone. His mother, who outlived Brubaker Sr., died in 1929 or 1930, and Hans was left by himself. The village naturally assumed that he would presently marry, but for some obscure reason he did not, although he showed a decided preference for one young woman. Now, there is no way of definitely knowing just when the strange progression of events, at first of seeming unimportance, began. But with the whole story complete, although I cannot say when it began, I can tell how it began. I know that during the first months, Hans did not suspect anything out of the ordinary. Obviously, he misunderstood, and so ignored the small beginnings which led slowly, step by step, toward horror. He told me, possibly 3 months ago, how it had begun. I thought the rats were fighting at first, he explained, with the uneasy, deprecatory laugh of the person who does not expect to be believed. There was a powerful lot of rats about the place. The cats kept them down somewhat, but there always seemed to be more growing up, scratching and squeaking in the walls. But the idea of their fighting, I remember thinking that there must be one awful big fellow in there somewhere. I could hear him scuffle, and then plop, down he'd come off a crossbeam between the walls, soft and heavy-like. And the cats heard him too. I watched them for a few weeks, snooping around, excited-like. Heard that big fellow go plop every once in a while, listened to the squeaking and running in the walls that seemed somehow scared. The idea got into my head that the big one was a killer. He was too, there's not a doubt of it. Whenever he was in one place, the rest were elsewhere. The mice began to desert the house for the barn. My cats got quite a number of them that way. Along about then, a strange thing happened. One day, I noticed a strange cat hanging around. White she was, and pretty. She stayed around the porch while I was feeding my own cats, and I tried to pet her and feed her, but she wouldn't come near me, and she wouldn't eat. Seemed interested only in Peter, a big tiger cat of mine. Well, that was natural, even if it did seem funny that she wouldn't eat. Peter watched her some, and that night he stayed out. He never came back, and I never heard the big rat from that night on in the walls again. You know how cats are around a farm. They earn their keep, and they're good company. I always had 7 or 8, sometimes as many as a dozen of them, and my cats began to disappear, one by one. In 2 weeks there were only a couple left. I couldn't understand it. I remember that I began to think somebody was poisoning them. The 2 that were left looked sick and scared, too, as if they knew something was wrong. And then one day they went away, and never came back. Even then I didn't have any suspicions that came near the truth, and for quite a while after that I didn't notice anything. But it began again. This night was colder, I remember. It must have been around the 1st of November. I had a chunk fire going. It was evening, and I was sitting with my feet in the oven. My shoes were on the floor on the left side of the chair, a big Morris chair that's in the kitchen. The fire was nice and warm. The doors were all shut, and I was smoking my pipe. The house was still as death. One of my 2 collie dogs was outside somewhere, and the other one, Nan, was lying close to the stove at my right, a foot or so from my chair, soaking in the warmth, sleeping. It must have been about 9:30. It certainly wasn't later than that. I enjoy that last hour or so before I get into bed. Everything is done for the day, and I can lie back and rest and think. I had everything arranged for solid comfort. The chair back was set just right, and my pipe was going good. Looking back now and trying to remember, I must have dozed off for a few minutes. I forget whether I put my pipe out or not. Maybe it just hung loose in my left hand and went out of itself. Anyway, I found it on the floor beside the stove afterward. Yes, I was probably just sleeping, with the pipe dangling in my hand. My right arm was hanging from the chair arm, limp-like, and as I began to come out of that little snooze, I reached down to stroke the dog. But as I came wide awake, I realized that there was something queer about that thing under my hand beside my chair. It didn't feel like a dog's back. It was the right distance from the floor, but it was slippery, and there wasn't any hair on it. My hand kept moving, but right off I knew that whatever I was petting, it wasn't any dog. I had the idea that if I pressed my hand down, I could push my fingers right into it. All this took a lot less time than in the telling. Maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I began to be scared. I turned to look, and God knows what I expected to see. Certainly nothing like what was there. It was a slimy sort of stuff, transparent-looking, without any shape to it. It looked as though if you picked it up, it would drip right through your fingers. And it was alive. I don't know how I knew that, but I was sure of it, even before I looked. It was alive, and a sort of shapeless arm of it lay across the dog's back and covered her head. She didn't move. I guess I yelled then, Dr. Kurt, and I jumped out of the chair and reached for the poker. That slimy thing hadn't moved, but I knew that if it wanted to, it could move like lightning. It was heavy-looking, too. I remember thinking that it must have weighed about 50 pounds. I hit at the thing with a poker, and quick as thought, the whole mess started sliding across the floor, stretching out as worms do, oozing under the crack beneath the door that leads onto the porch. Before I knew it, the thing was gone. I looked at Nan. She hadn't moved, and she seemed asleep. I shook her until she opened her eyes, and her eyes looked dead. Well, Dr. Kurt, you'll believe me when I tell you that I didn't sleep that night. I caught myself listening for noises, not that I knew what to listen for, except the sound of that thing sliding back into the house again, for I remembered that it could go through a crack. If I looked once around that kitchen, everywhere, I looked 100 times. Peg didn't come back all night. That was strange, because she usually stayed right around close. It was just as though she was afraid. As it was just getting light, Peg came up on the porch. I was glad to hear her, and I let her in quick. Then she saw Nan. She made a funny sort of howling noise, and her ears dropped flat against her head. Then she went for Nan. Froth was beginning to run from her mouth. It was just as though, although she was trying to kill Nan, she was deathly afraid. It wasn't pretty to see. Nan didn't fight back. She just lay there, as though she didn't see what it was, as though she didn't know enough to try to fight or run. If I hadn't dragged Peg off, Nan would have been dead in another minute. And even after I had put Peg outdoors, Nan didn't move much. She just shuddered a little, and she didn't even lick at the places where the blood was running down. I had to shoot her then. It made me sick to do it. Then I dragged her out off the back porch and went to the barn to do the milking. I didn't eat any breakfast. I felt sick to the stomach. After I'd finished the chores around the barn, I got a shovel and went back to the house. Nan's body was gone. There wasn't a sign of her, not a bone or a patch of hair, nothing but a clean scuffed place in the grass. At first I thought I might have made a mistake, Maybe I had left her around the other side of the house. But I went around to the front porch and Nan was nowhere. The funny thing, Dr. Kurt, is that somehow I knew that it would happen just like it did. I didn't say anything to anybody then. I just watched and waited. And a few weeks later, I saw the dog that looked like Nan, Dr. Kurt. It was Nan, yet it wasn't. I saw her hanging around the barnyard, and I whistled to her, absent-minded, and then I remembered that Nan was dead. But it looked like Nan, and I knew that it was waiting for Peg to come out. I knew that it wasn't Nan, Dr. Kurt, because it didn't come when I whistled. 2 or 3 times that week I saw that dog that looked like Nan and that wasn't Nan hanging around, and each time she looked thinner and weaker. And then, after a few days, I didn't see her any more. She'd just gone away. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, one day, I spotted a strange dog, a big dog, hanging around. And that night, Peg vanished. She never came back. You can see how it was, Dr. Kurt. I began to see a sort of pattern to it. First the mice, then the cats, then the dogs. I got to wondering if it would get the cattle next, or maybe the people. Abruptly, Hans paused. I think that then I carried it off perfectly. I did not utter a word, but merely waited impassively. Whatever I did or omitted to do, it gave Hans confidence, for after a moment he went on. Dr. Kurt, as sure as I'm sitting here, it's gone from animals to humans. Humans? I asked. Hans nodded. It's happened, he said softly. One afternoon, 3 weeks ago, I was standing in the yard. You know that along about then we were having stiff frosts every morning and night. I saw this strange boy coming down the road. He wasn't more than 12 or 13 years old, and he was wearing odds and ends of clothes that looked as though he had picked them up anywhere. I looked at him, and right away I knew that he was a runaway. The kid, as he walked along, kept looking at the house as if he had half a mind to stop. But he didn't stop, just went on past slowly, looking back from time to time. I went down the driveway, and I almost called out to him, but I didn't. It was as if something inside me said, Don't call. That thing you see there isn't a boy. It's death in the shape of a boy. That's what I seemed to think, Dr. Kurt. I was scared and ashamed, too. I was so ashamed that I went right down to the road with the idea of yelling at the boy. Then I happened to look down at my feet. You know I told you that there had been a frost, Dr. Kurt. It was cold enough all night to form good, solid ice, and there had been a thaw for a couple of days beforehand. Well, that slushy stuff in the road had frozen, not hard enough to hold a horse or a cow, but plenty hard enough to hold a fairly heavy man, because when I walked on it, it didn't crack or break, except once in every 5 or 6 steps. But where that kid had walked, the ice was broken at every step, and he looked to weigh not more than half what I do. I looked at those tracks in the frozen slush, Dr. Kurt, and then I turned around and walked to the house. I knew then that the thing had come back. Maybe my house is home to it. Maybe, because it began in my house, it likes to come back. I wanted to tell then, but I didn't dare. I was afraid people would laugh, but I'm going to tell now, because 2 days ago the Peterson kid disappeared, and he hasn't come back. And what's more, he'll never come back. He's part of that thing that began in my walls with the rats. Hans stopped speaking. I knew that there was nothing more for him to tell. The room was oddly silent. Presently, he asked, What can be done about it? I didn't know what to say, but I felt that I should say something, should try at least, to quiet the man's nerves. Go home, I advised at last, gently. Get a good night's sleep, and come back tomorrow. I'll have thought it over by then. 2. That night I sat up late, pondering the story Hans had told me. Perhaps at that time I almost believed him, and in the morning, as I had expected, he returned. It all looked much more impossible in the bright light of mid-morning than it had looked the evening before. I grasped at the idea that, although something extremely strange might be going on, yet the explanation might come presently of itself in a purely matter-of-fact manner. In effect, that is what I told Brubaker. Hans went away disappointed, almost angry, and not more than 20 minutes after he left my office, Hilda Lang came in. She seemed extraordinarily perturbed. "Dr. Kurt," she began abruptly, "do you think that Hans is crazy?" "Why do you ask?" I returned. Talking with her was different from talking with Hans. She was a beautiful young woman, tall, long-waisted, slender-limbed, with fair blue eyes and yellow hair, and a gloriously clear skin. There was something imperiously demanding about her that disturbed me. She looked at me. Then she made a curious, impatient gesture. "Oh, don't pretend. You know that Hans came to you yesterday with a story. He has told me the same things that he told you. Dr. Kurt, you know about all this. Do you think he is crazy?" I shook my head. "Don't worry on that account, Hilda. Hans is not crazy. He may be fooled, he may even be fooling himself, but he is sane." Hilda sighed in relief. "Thank God for that. I was worried." Then, as a sudden, new thought struck her, she leaned forward tensely. "But if he is sane, his story is true." She paused. I said nothing. "I'm going to marry him," she said abruptly. "He's been afraid of this thing long enough. If there's nothing to it, it shouldn't keep us apart. And if he's in danger, 2 people in that lonely house are better than 1. I waited a long time, while the room hung silent, before I replied. "You believe in this danger, then?" I asked. "Yes, I believe in it. As I believe in Hans, I believe in it." And in a little while she went away. For the rest of the week I went about my usual routine. Hans, of course, did not come back, but I learned that he suddenly married Hilda, and that they were living at the Brubaker farm. A day or 2 later, I drove out to see them. Hans was working about the back of the house as I drove into the yard. He straightened slowly, put down the tools from his hands, and walked over to the car. He looked tired, as though he had not been sleeping well. Shutting off the motor, I climbed from the car. Then, while I was close to him, Hans whispered hoarsely, "There is danger here, Dr. Kurt. I can feel it. I watch every night, Doctor. I have seen things that I haven't told her about. I can't tell her. I want to sell the place and go away where it's safe. But Hilda laughs. She hasn't seen the things I've seen." "Just what have you seen?" I asked. He looked at me eagerly. "Come to the house tonight, after Hilda has gone to bed," he whispered. I nodded. Then we were at the kitchen door, and there was Hilda, smiling, beautiful in her tall, strong fairness, welcoming me to her home. That night, at 11 o'clock, I returned down the rutted road that led to the Brubaker farm. It was abysmally dark, but it was not cold. I remember thinking that it might snow before morning. Long before I reached the Brubakers, I could see 2 tiny yellow lights at the back of the house, the kitchen and the back bedroom. I drove past the house 100 yards, parked the car alongside the road, and returned to the house on foot. I did not look at my watch, so I do not know how long I stood outside in the driveway. Waiting like that seems interminable, I know, and obviously I could not come in until Hilda was asleep. At last both lights were put out, almost simultaneously, and in a few minutes, as I had expected, the light in the kitchen flared up again. I walked softly to the rear door and knocked. Hans let me in immediately. I stepped into the kitchen, my eyes slightly dazzled by the brilliance within, and it was not until I had been comfortably seated beside the table that I noticed with a start what Hans was doing. He was sealing the bedroom door off from the kitchen with a wax, making the passageway between the two rooms hermetically tight. He worked with the rapidity of one who does a task he has performed before. Presently he had sealed the doorway in its entirety. Then he put the remaining mass of wax in a piece of brown paper and carefully hid it away behind the woodbox in the corner. He came across the room and sat down close beside me. We talked in whispers. "I'm learning all the time what the thing can do," he told me. "It came back 3 days ago. But I'm tired to death. I haven't slept." I looked at him, at the reddish bloodshot color of his eyes, at his sunken cheeks. "Why don't you sleep now?" I suggested. "I'll watch." He looked at me eagerly. "You're safe. It can't come in unless you're asleep, or unless you invite it in. I've learned that. But if anything happens, wake me." I nodded. "It'll be all right. Don't worry." Exhausted, he lay back and closed his eyes. He fell asleep almost at once. Outside, it had begun to snow, and the soft, heavy flakes made a steady rustling against the window. I looked out curiously. I noticed that the window had been nailed shut, and the crevices stuffed with putty and painted over. I went outside impulsively and looked at the bedroom windows. They too were nailed and puttied tight, and I saw that the whole back end of the house had been freshly painted. "He's got those 2 rooms airtight and watertight, all right," I thought. Back in the kitchen again, I remembered uneasily that I was supposed to be on watch. But nothing had happened. Hans still slept. The fire still burned softly. The snow drifted and fell away from the black window pane. And then, abruptly as a flash of lightning striking into the room, the whole calmness with which I had surrounded myself, my whole sense of security, vanished as though it had never been. Not that there was any physical happening. There was nothing in that sense. But there was a sudden, sweeping realization that some mighty, malignant force had turned its whole attention upon the house. I sat up sharply and walked to the door, where I stood listening. There was no sound from outside, and the snow I could see out of the corner of my eye as I half glanced at the window was still falling steadily. I waited, perhaps 5 minutes, and still that terrible awareness of some horrible force overhanging, impending, persisted. Then I threw the door wide and stepped out upon the back porch, but nothing was there. I turned back into the kitchen, and then I saw, fleetingly, something move at the kitchen window. The window was beyond the table, beyond the light, beyond Hans's sleeping figure. It was greyish with the constant touching of fingers of snow, and it seemed to me that, for a second, I saw something slipping down the window pane, something that clung to the pane like a colourless jelly, almost like a wave of watery foam, almost like a nothingness that moved heavily down the window pane and disappeared below the sill. The glimpse, or vision, whatever it was fragmentary. I remember that I thought, even as I crossed the floor toward the window to look out, that it might well be illusion. But when I reached the window, I paused, stock still, pondering. The snow, had been wiped cleanly from the sill, better than it could have been done with a broom, and I realized that here at last was evidence, physical evidence, that something had been pressed down upon the sill a few moments ago, for I could yet count the flakes as they fell thickly upon the still bare wood. My lips moving unconsciously while I uttered soundless words, I stood there, watching the snow fall rustling upon the sill until the wood was again unbrokenly sheathed with white. Something had swept that snow away. I went outdoors again and stood again outside the window in the snow. I looked down, and at my feet the snow had been packed down, and, leading away from the house for a short distance, I saw a sharply marked track, like the trail that might be made by rolling a large ball, and beyond the rectangle of light that the window loosed into the snow-ridden gloom, that track became a trail of human footprints. Then my courage deserted me. Only one thought remained in my mind, to get back into that house as fast as I could. I got back into the kitchen at once. Hans was awake. The cold air from the open door had roused him. He looked at me, at first uncomprehendingly, then alertly, and I saw that he knew pretty well what had happened. He sat up, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping half erect in a chair. "Did someone come to the door?" he asked. I shook my head, pointing to the window. There was a sort of grey fog against the window. It lasted only a moment. I went outside. There are tracks in the snow. Hans looked at me queerly. Tracks like nothing on earth, or human tracks? My voice was harsh and high-pitched as I answered, "Tracks like both." As the day slowly lightened, Hans stripped the moulding of wax from the bedroom door, shaped it between his hands, and affixed it to the lump behind the woodbox. I left the house before Hilda awoke, and returned to the village. At twilight, I drove my car again into the Brubaker yard, and walked to the house, greyish, apprehensive-seeming in the falling darkness. Entering the house, I realized at once that Hans had told Hilda everything. Stamped on the faces and engraved in the speech of both man and wife was a determination to fight the thing that threatened their home. Hilda, brave girl, brought out a pinochle deck, but before we could sit down to play, there came an interruption. A car turned into the driveway, pulled up beside the house, and a farmer came in, a man named Brent, who lived nearby. He shook his head when Hans asked him to sit down. "My Bertha," he stammered eagerly. "Have you seen anything of her?" I felt a tingle of fear. "She's gone. She's run away. She's been going around too much with that Irish Catholic Fagin. I put my foot down. 'I'll run away, Papa,' she told me. And now she's done it. She's gone. Did she walk to town? 2 miles? "It's a bad night out," Hilda said doubtfully. "I think that if you inquire at the houses along the road, you'll probably find her," I said. Presently, the man went out. "Do you think it was that?" Hans asked, when he had gone. I shook my head. It was perfectly plain what had happened. We began to play pinochle, and nothing out of the ordinary occurred. The malignant influence seemed to have departed the vicinity. The house seemed more than usually cozy and peaceful, and from time to time I caught myself wondering if, after all, I might not be acting like a fool. 3. The next night also, nothing happened. Hans, with his first-hand knowledge of the thing, suggested that it had fed elsewhere, and that there would be a quiescent period. And, feeling that I was neglecting my practice, I stayed away from the farm for a few days. But, late Saturday afternoon, I found a note from Hans. "It has come back," he had written. After supper, I took my car and drove out to Brubaker Farm. There had been a heavy thaw, which had held on for several days. The roads were mere ribbons of mud and dirty ice. Both husband and wife looked inhumanly tired. I noticed that Hans had not shaved for 2 or 3 days. "We didn't want to trouble you," he told me. "We've slept a little in the daytime, taking turns, but even in the day we can feel the thing near the house, and we're deathly tired." "Sit quietly and don't speak," Hilda said softly, "and you will feel it." I sat as she had asked, and, striking inward at me, I could sense the same crawling horror that I had known before. I looked at the others. "Yes, I can feel it. But Hans, Hilda, you're utterly exhausted. Lie down now and rest. I'll watch." Hans nodded eagerly toward Hilda. "Lie down and try to sleep, darling. Dr. Kurt will sit up with me. It will be safe." Hilda stood up uncertainly and went into the bedroom. I poured out half a tumblerful of brandy, diluted it with water, and made Hans drain the glass. The liquor seemed to strengthen him, and I talked. "We can beat this thing in 2 ways, Hans. We know that it is a mass of dead-alive cells controlled by a deathless malign entity. The Slavic peoples had the right idea when they, as they thought, trapped vampires in their coffins, drove stakes through their hearts, and sealed the coffins. What they did not truly realize was the nature of the being they combated. Because the thing is half physical, it has, to an extent, physical limitations. It must sleep. And what, in effect, those old-timers did was to catch their vampire asleep and seal it in a box which, fortunately, happened to be strong enough to resist its physical strength. The stake through the heart meant nothing. It was the airtight, solid coffin that did the business, restrain the thing until, as its physical substance slowly died, so was its spirit rendered homeless. Now, we know that this entity is strongly attracted to this particular vicinity. In the course of time, it will find a permanent place where it can sleep, a barrel perhaps, or a cistern, or an old trunk, or even a casket, if there's such a thing available. And if we can find that hiding place, and while the thing is within, seal its receptacle hermetically tight, we will have beaten it. There is yet another way to beat the thing, Hans. That way is for someone to invite it to absorb him, if it can. The entity will try, Hans, for it knows nothing of fear. Then, if the man's will is greater, the man will win. Otherwise, the thing will absorb him, continue to grow, and he will cease to exist. Hans's eyes were closed, but when I stopped speaking, he roused himself enough to mutter, "I'm falling asleep." Then his head drooped forward heavily. Leisurely, I opened a book and began to read. A night of wakefulness lay ahead. The hours slipped slowly by. I could hear Hilda through the half-opened bedroom door, breathing slowly and deeply. Hans beside me snored irregularly. It was close to 3 when I heard footsteps sloshing up the driveway, passing around behind the house, hesitating, slowly ascending the steps. Then a knock. Looking back now, I think that at that moment I was horribly afraid, even though a revolver lay on the table, and I certainly had no lurking fear that the thing would walk up to the house like that. My body chilled with fear, I opened the door, and then I exclaimed with relief, for outside on the porch, bedraggled with mud and slush, stood 18-year-old Bertha Brent. She wore a shapeless, dirty, unpressed coat. When she saw me, she shrank back away from the door. "Bertha, you poor kid, come in and dry out those wringing wet clothes and tell me what's wrong," I noticed that she looked curiously at Hans. "There's been sickness," I explained hurriedly. "Nothing serious. Hans has been up 2 or 3 nights." I looked at her squarely. "So you're back?" She glanced at me timidly. "You know, then, that I ran away?" "Yes, I knew. But here, sit down by the fire. There, take off your coat." Suddenly, for some unaccountable reason, I remembered why I was at Brubaker's at 3 o'clock in the morning. I remembered all that Hans had told me about the strange white cat, about the dog that looked like Nan, about the boy who had wandered down the road. I laughed then at the silliness of it. "This is Bertha, all right," I told myself. "She's the same girl she always was, right as rain, except that she's a little tired." And, almost aping my thought, Bertha said, "Could I lie down beside Hilda? I daren't go home tonight. I daren't." I was pottering around the stove with my back turned toward the girl, trying to warm over some coffee. "Lie down beside Hilda?" I said absently. In a minute. I went to the corner cupboard and found a cup and saucer. Then I poured out the coffee, doctored it plentifully with milk and sugar, and turned back to Bertha. She was not in the room. "Bertha?" I called softly. The crawling, cold sensation had begun again at the base of my spine. To my inexpressible relief, her voice answered from the bedroom. "Here, Dr. Kurt. I'm so tired." "Come and get your coffee. Then you can lie down and rest. What you need now is food." "I know," she answered slowly. "But I'm so tired. And you said that in a minute I could lie down with Hilda. It's been a minute." Just like a child. But I was impatient. "You mustn't lie on Hilda's bed while you're all dirty. You'll have to wash first." There was a little pause. Then the voice answered, still softly, "Hilda won't mind. Hilda's asleep. Hilda's sound asleep." I went to the doorway and stood there uncertainly, half in gloom, half in brightness. I could see the figures of the 2 women lying on the bed, close against each other, almost, my imagination told me, melting together. "Come, Bertha," I said mildly. "You're dirtying Hilda's bed." There was no answer. As my eyes became more accustomed to the dimness, I could see that there on the bed there were no longer 2 women. The 2 bodies were pressing together like ghastly Siamese twins, dissolving together into one. My heart in that instant froze like a lump of ice. Somehow, my whole body trembling horribly, I leaped across the half-darkened room, knelt on the bed, and dug frenzied fingers into the thing that had looked like Bertha, and that was now eating the sleeping woman, dissolving her as might a powerful acid. My fingers, beneath the muddy, tattered garment, sank deep, not into the firm flesh of a living girl, but into a yielding mass of protoplasmic slime. Then I screamed, and, as I fought and tore at the flaccid jelly-like mess, I screamed again and again without pause, like a madman, without hearing my own voice, knowing only from the tautness of my throat and the beating of my breath that I shrieked. It was like trying to grasp something that would not be grasped. The stuff beneath the garments ran like water in a bag, and I saw that the thing was slowly giving up pretense of human shape. The face was changing. The hands and arms and the contours of the body were dissolving. And in the last second before it melted into shapeless slime, from that vanishing mouth came Bertha Brandt's voice, crying, "I didn't do it, Dr. Kurt. I didn't." Then the thing was only a mass of jelly, still clinging like some loathsome, colourless leech to Hilda's back and shoulders. My body shrinking, I crawled over it and through it, seized Hilda's arms, and pulled her off the bed onto the floor. And then I screamed again, for of Hilda there was left only half a body. Her spine lay bare, her ribs curved nakedly, her skull gaped, her entrails drooped across the dingy carpet. It was like a slaughterhouse in hell. Suddenly, the light streaming through the doorway dimmed, and I saw Hans standing there, the gun in his hand. I saw the spurting red flames, and heard the crash of firing. I saw the pulpy mass on the bed jerk and shiver as each slug tore through it. Then there was silence, yet through the haze of smoke I saw the mess of protoplasmic slime drip slowly off the bed and slide across the floor toward the horrible ruin that had once been a woman. And on my hands and knees I tried to push it back, scooping at it as, unconcernedly, the thing flowed across the floor, between my fingers, and again fastened upon Hilda. Hans was kneeling beside me, but we couldn't keep the thing away from the dead woman. It wasn't possible. Then, abruptly, Hans stood up. His face was ghastly white, like the face of a dead man. Without a backward glance, he left the corpse, with that awful thing still crawling over it, and went out of the room into the kitchen. And there I saw him take a pat of wax from the wood-box, heat it over the stove, and methodically seal the crevices in the kitchen door, leading out onto the porch. When he had finished, he nodded grimly at me, made a wide gesture that included kitchen and bedroom. "A coffin, Dr. Kurt," he said slowly. "I have made a coffin of these rooms, and sealed the thing in it. When it is slime, it cannot escape, and when it is in the shape of a human being, we can fight it, so that it cannot unlock the door." Then he went back into the bedroom, and slowly I followed. We had been in the kitchen only a few minutes, but in those minutes the horror had finished its ghastly work. Nothing remained of Hilda. Only a bag of clothes lay there limply, and nestling in them glistened a great mound of watery jelly-like stuff, faintly quivering, alertly alive. Then I saw that Hans had brought matches and strips of newspaper. As I watched, he twisted the paper into spills, lit one, and plunged the flaming mass against the globule of colorless life on the floor. The mound of stuff quivered and writhed and slid swiftly across the floor. As it sought to escape, Hans, his eyes intent, his stubbled jaws grim, followed it about the room, always keeping the blazing paper torches pressed against the shrinking, unholy thing. The air was becoming thick with rancid smoke, and the odor of burning flesh filled the room. Stumbling, sobbing, together we attacked the horror. Here and there on floor and carpet showed brown, charred smears. The thing's silent, sliding attempts to escape were somehow more terrible than if it had cried out in agony. The smoke in the room had become a thick haze, and then the thing seemed to gather purpose. It rolled swiftly across the bedroom floor, stopped upon the disheveled pile of clothes that Hilda had worn, and, as we paused to light fresh spills, it changed. It reared erect as a fountain might gush up. It put forth arms, developed breasts, overspread itself with color. In the time that it might take to draw a long breath, the thing had vanished, and a something that we knew to be that same ghastly entity, but that looked as Hilda had looked in life, stood naked there amid the jumbled clothes. Swiftly the entity, for I cannot call it by Hilda's name, stooped and drew about itself the skirt and blouse. Then, barefooted and stockingless, it walked into the kitchen. Like a man awakening from drugged slumber, Hans leaped before the door, held up a blazing spill. The thing spoke, and the voice was the voice of Hilda. "I want to go out, Hans." It moved forward slightly. Hans, his features racked, almost unrecognizable, thrust the blazing paper before him menacingly. "You'll never leave this house. We're going to burn you." The thing that looked and spoke like Hilda shook its head, and I gasped to see the wavy, fine blonde tresses undulate and shimmer with the gesture. And it smiled. "You'll never burn me, Hans. I'm a prisoner, Hans. You want to destroy the thing that holds me, but you don't want to burn me to death, Hans. For as yet I haven't suffered except from your fire. I'm Hilda, Hans." Then Hans asked hoarsely, and I saw that the fire was burning his fingers, "How can I know?" The thing smiled. "You can't know, Hans, but if you destroy me, Hilda suffers. Let me go." Then Hans shook his head. "No, we will stay here until you starve, until you rot into nothingness." Came the inexorable reply, "As I suffer, Hilda suffers. As I starve, she starves." Hans looked at me, and I could see that he was nerving himself toward an incredibility. "Then, by heaven, Dr. Kurt, I will try the other way." He looked at the entity, at the thing that looked like Hilda. "Come, Hilda," he said simply. "If you're a prisoner in that thing before me, hear me. I want to join you. I want to join you and Bertha and Nan, and God only knows what other unfortunate creatures with souls who have been overcome. But I do not surrender, and I cannot be beaten by guile. Let the thing come and attempt to subdue me. And help me, Hilda and Bertha and all the rest, help me." He stood there before the door, his arms extended, his body rigid. And then the horror that looked like Hilda slowly moved forward, a smile on its lips, came closer and closer to him, touched him, was enfolded in his arms, lips touching lips. And Hans's strong arms flexed, and in turn it embraced him, a smile on its sweetly beautiful face. And, as they stood there, the man and the being whose very nature remains an unanswerable question, I prayed as I have never prayed before, prayed that the good overcome the evil. For minutes that seemed hours they stood there, motionless. Treading softly, I moved a step forward, and I caught a glimpse of the thing's eyes. And I was comforted, for I seemed to read in them something of humanity that could not have come to them through guile. I sensed that in truth those others who had been engulfed were fighting on the side of the man. And, as I watched, the horror seemed to become frailer and weaker, slowly at first, and then faster and faster, as before my eyes the semblance of Hilda faded into nothingness, and only Hans remained, holding tightly clasped in his arms a crumpled skirt and blouse. And even yet for long minutes Hans did not move, and I sensed that still some metamorphosis went on, some change invisible to human eyes. But at last Hans moved, and looking at the bundle of clothes in his arms, as might an awakened sleeper, he stroked them tenderly and put them gently down on the table. At last he spoke to me, and his voice was the voice of the man I had known, but immeasurably more beautiful, immeasurably more strong. We worked together, we fought together, Hilda and Bertha, and those unfortunate boys, and Nan, and you, Dr. Kurt, too, and we have won. He walked across the floor to the center of the room, and I watched the stout boards give beneath his weight. And yet I can feel the thing inside me, like a devilish flame that would eat me if it could. It is in me, and I think that it cannot escape. I pray that it never overcome me and escape. Then he looked at me thoughtfully. In the eyes of the town, Dr. Kurt, there is a mystery here. Hilda is gone, and Bertha Brent, and the Peterson boy. So you must go to your home and you must say that you have been visiting me, and that I am insane. As for me, I will leave a note and go away, and the people will believe that I am a murderer, and that I have run away." I bowed my head silently. He spoke the truth. He must go away, and the world would believe him a butchering maniac. For a long time he did not speak, but stood there silently, his head sunk upon his breast as he thought. Then, "I will walk to your car with you. I thank you, we all thank you, for what you have done. Probably I shall never see you again." He led me from the house. Then I was sitting in the car, the motor running softly, while Hans stood there before me in the damp snow. He extended his hand. "Goodbye, goodbye," I said inanely. And, while yet he stood there in the snow beside the house, I drove away. Thus it is that our village believes that Hans murdered with bloodthirsty abandon, and then, fearing detection, mysteriously escaped. I alone know the truth, and the truth weighs heavily upon me. And so, I have begun to prepare a record of the true happenings in the Brubaker case, and presently I shall see that this record is brought before the proper authorities. Meanwhile, I wonder, where and what is Hans? If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,